Welcome back, randos, to my breakdown of the Hobbit trilogy. So far, it isn't very good, but who knows, maybe the Battle of the Five Armies will surprise me. Even people who like the Hobbit trilogy, as I did when I first watched it, seem to agree that the Battle of the Five Armies is where everything falls apart. Check out parts 1 and 2 if you are new to the channel, but with that out of the way, let's dive straight in. We re-enter Middle-Earth exactly where the Desolation of Smaug left off. We are in Lake Town, there is fire on the horizon, and the Lake Townians are panicking. We see Evil McGee blaming everyone else for his own failure, whilst ordering his underlings to carry his valuables to an escape pod, all the while making abundantly certain that the audience understands that he is evil, selfish, incompetent, hypocritical, short-sighted, and greedy.
I warned you! Did I not warn you what would come of dealing with dwarves? They've woken the dragon! They've brought an apocalypse upon our heads! Faster now! I'm trying to evacuate myself here!
The Fellowship of the Ring began with a flashback depicting the forging of the rings. The Two Towers began with a flashback depicting Gandalf battling the Balrog. The Return of the King began with a flashback depicting Gollum's transformation. An Unexpected Journey began with a flashback depicting the fall of Erebor. The Desolation of Smaug began with a flashback depicting Thorin and Gandalf planning their mission. The Battle of the Five Armies begins with an irritating zero-dimensional clown person rambling about how evil and selfish he is.
This, to me, might be considered kind of a step backwards.
Suffice it to say, we are not off to a good start. And just in case you hadn't worked out what this character's priorities are, despite the multiple occasions where he has said peasants bad, money good, we get this.
Sire, should we not try to save the town?
The town is lost! Save the gold!
And with that, I'm done dedicating time to this character. I think I've said enough in the previous video. Zero-dimensional pantomime clowns that exist to entertain 5-year-olds are rather frustrating when attempting to deconstruct them because they are about as complex as a paper aeroplane. Anyway, we see that the other people of Lake Town are also trying to evacuate with their belongings. The film could have started right here, with the people Bilbo claims to care about trying to save their loved ones before Smaug arrives, but I guess they hired Stephen Fry and so needed to make the most of him. We then see that Ladylas was rather successful in her healing of Kili.
Get him up.
Come on, brother, come on, let's go.
Fine, I can walk.
Fast as you can.
As we will soon see, Kili appears to be not only mobile, but you would be forgiven for forgetting that he was moments from death moments ago. Remember, this scene is taking place almost immediately after the healing scene from the Desolation of Smaug. Maybe this can be explained by the fact that Kili is a dwarf and as such is more resilient than the other races? Maybe this can be explained by the fact that Ladylas is a god when it comes to healing people, as she has demonstrated that she is far more capable than either Elrond or Arwen? Or maybe this can be explained by the fact that Kili needs to be mobile now because it's time for an action scene. I will let you decide. Also, maybe I should have noted this at the end of the last video, but this scene confirms that, yeah, Legolas he's gone. He chased the orcs over the bridge and out of Lake Town and has not returned. Even though he covets Ladylas's firm booty, even though he knows who Thorin is and what he intends to do, even though there is fire on the goddamn horizon indicating that a goddamn dragon is coming. As we will see later, Legolas does eventually decide to return, after the dragon has been dealt with, of course, but for now I guess he just really didn't like the fact that Bolg made him bleed his own blood. Anyway, Gaston's son says that he will not leave without Gaston, and Ladylas tells him that they have to leave or they will die. Excellent dialogue once again from this certified wordsmith. Meanwhile, Gaston is still locked up because he is guilty of... and he sees that Smaug has arrived. Anyway, Ladylas, the children, and the dwarves begin their escape on Gaston's boat. So this is the third time we have seen that Smaug is already here in Lake Town. You may be asking yourselves, why is Smaug waiting? Surely he would just annihilate everything because that's kind of what Smaug does. And I want to offer a defense. If you recall from the previous film, Smaug is extremely proud and vain, and he thinks that he cannot be defeated. He is also vindictive and sadistic. His reason for being here is multifaceted. He wants to show Thorin the true meaning of revenge. He wants the people Bilbo cares about to suffer. He believes the Lake Townians are working with the dwarves and are therefore partly to blame for his humiliation at the end of the previous film. He has also been asleep for a very long time, and he is likely gagging for a bit of carnage. He does not simply want to murder everything as efficiently as possible. He wants to make a show of it. He wants to terrify the living shit out of everyone, to torture them, to make sure they understand how hopeless their situation is before finally incinerating them. This will ultimately prove to be Smaug's downfall in approximately, 8 minutes. Spoiler alert, I guess. But this is absolutely in character for him. So then the Burnination begins, and Smaug starts to torch Lake Town. Gaston is still locked in his cell and is still trying desperately to escape. During the mayhem, we see that Evil McGee is still in Lake Town and is trying to escape on his boat filled to the brim with gold and accompanied by, I assume, the entirety of the town guard.
If only we could take more of these poor people with us, but they're hardly
Worth it. I quite agree.
Stop it, film. Stop trying to bait me. I am stronger than this. And then this happens. Alright, I guess I'm not stronger than this. I now have no choice but to continue talking about these two characters because for some incomprehensible reason, they are vital to the plot of this movie. Their absurd behavior is a prerequisite for understanding the narrative progression in this film. So, here we go. Evil McGee's boat crashes into the good guy's boat. Firstly, this is depicted as if it was unavoidable, but neither boat is traveling very quickly, and yet they both ram into each other despite the fact that they should each clearly be able to see the other boat. Secondly, this is a random coincidence. There is no narrative reason why these two boats should be in the same location at the same time. Anyway, suddenly Greasebag realizes...
Let go!
We're carrying too much weight.
Which is yet another unbelievably obvious setup. I'm going to let you guess. What do you think happens next? Pantomime villain number 1 says to pantomime villain number 2 that they're carrying too much weight. What do you think will happen next?
We need to dump something.
I am going to guess that every single last fucking one of you was absolutely correct. Character nuance be damned, I guess. But then it gets worse. So I need to take this moment slow because there is a lot to say about it. Not only did they just so happen to bump into the main characters, but they also just so happen to be sailing right past the prison cell where Gaston is currently locked up. What are the chances? Well, saying that, Evil McGee and Greasebag already have a track record of being in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, so now I guess it's time for them to be exactly where Gaston needs them to be instead of vice versa. Gaston has thrown what appears to be a rope out of his cell in order to try and use it to bust himself out of jail. My first thought was why and how does he have a rope? One would think that giving prisoners access to rope might be an intensely stupid thing to do for obvious reasons, but this moment is surprisingly not reliant on in-universe stupidity. It is instead reliant on incredibly good and bad luck, as well as Gaston having the fabric-bending skills of a middle-aged cat-hoarding spinster. For you see, this is not a rope. Gaston has made this. He has woven together this fabric that was presumably taken from the bed inside his cell and turned it into a rope. He has managed to weave this fabric into a functional rope in a minute? 2 minutes? It can't really have been any longer than that because he saw Smaug flying around before he started making the rope, so either Smaug has been patiently waiting for him or he managed to level up rope bending in a matter of seconds. So anyway, let's skip past the how and move on to the why. Why has Gaston made this rope? Well, upon realizing that Evil McGee and his Evil McBoat just so happen to be traveling under his cell, he throws the rope out of the window and is miraculously able to hook Evil McGee around the throat as the boat goes past. So, either he planned this, in which case he did legitimately see Evil McGee's boat approaching and then craft his rope in 10 seconds flat, or he made the rope preemptively for some bizarre reason, and then realized he can hook it onto the passing boat. Anyway, the rope goes tight, slams into the bars, and pins Evil McGee to the back of his boat. The force of this is enough to break open the wall of his cell, but it is also not enough to slice Evil McGee in half. This may suggest that his neck is stronger than the walls of a building, but as we are about to see Gaston put his foot through a roof, this isn't actually an inconsistency. It just means that these buildings have the structural integrity of the plot of Rings of Power. Anyway, after his fantastical escape, Gaston acquires a bow from the armory and heads towards the bell tower to get a clear shot at Smaug. Okay, Evil McGee is evil, selfish, incompetent, hypocritical, short-sighted, and greedy. Ladylas is unbelievably skilled at healing. Kili got better. Legolas cares more about fighting orcs than saving either Ladylas or any innocent peasants. Greasebag is cartoonishly evil. Gaston is extremely skilled at fabric weaving, is ingenious, and is brave. We then rejoin the dwarves and Bilbo, who are observing Smaug's destruction of Lake Town from a distance.
Poor souls.
Yeah, you could say that. None of these characters seem to realize that this is entirely their fault. There is no moral complexity present here. None of the dwarves at any point considered the consequences of their failure. This concept was never even brought up until Gaston addressed the citizens of Lake Town in the previous film.
Have you forgotten what happened to Dale? Have you forgotten those who died in the firestorm?
The dwarves just seem to be like, wee, let's go get our home back. Oh, right, there's a drag. Oh, wait, no, and oh dear, he's awake. And okay, he's going on a murderous rampage.
Shit.
Who could have possibly seen this coming? And now an entire town is being murdered, and the dwarves do not seem aware that they are to blame. One potential fix for this would have been if Thorin had good reason to believe that Smaug was dead. This would mean that the risk of waking him is far, far lower, and it would mean that the dwarves would not need to weigh their desire to reclaim Erebor with the risk of unleashing a fire-breathing monster. As depicted, no one at any point wrestles with the risk of unleashing a fire-breathing monster, despite them all being extremely aware of this risk.
Well, that would be a reference to Smaug the Terrible.
Airborne fire breather. Teeth like razors, claws like meat hooks.
Oh, aye, he'll melt the flesh off your bones in the blink of an eye.
What the films have communicated clearly is that Thorin is willing to risk unleashing Smaug in order to reclaim his home. This is not a problem, inherently, because this is absolutely crystal clear. Thorin is cognizant of the risk, and he is willing to proceed regardless.
You have no right. No right to enter that mountain. I have the only right.
Does this make Thorin a dick? Yes. Does this make him a badly written character? No. It is possible that all of the other dwarves share his viewpoint one for one, but as the film never depicts any conflict between the dwarves as to the moral complexity of their mission and the risks involved, I find it very hard to take
Poor souls.
seriously as an honest portrayal of empathy. What this scene needed was for one, possibly many of the dwarves to declare, "This is on us, we knew the risks, look at what we have done." And Bilbo, to his credit, said precisely this at the end of the previous film.
What have we done?
The dwarves, however, not so much. Anyway, we cut back to Lake Town and see Gaston racing across the rooftops to get to his vantage point. Because we needed even more maximum in the most maximum of drama and tension, Smaug sees this and decides to chase him. Smaug has no way of knowing who Gaston is or what he intends to do, but as Gaston is the only person running around on the rooftops, it is probably reasonable for Smaug to want to kill him just in case. However, he does not use his fire breath because Gaston is decked out head to toe in master-crafted plot armor. We also see the boat containing Ladylas, Gaston's children, and the dwarves. They don't appear to have any kind of plan. They are simply drifting around the town, praying that they don't roll a critical failure on their stealth check, and hoping that Smaug doesn't kill them, meaning that their survival is entirely out of their hands. Anyway, Gaston climbs the bell tower and fires 2 shots at Smaug. This is very confusing. Both we and Gaston are intimately aware of how to kill Smaug. You need to shoot him with a black arrow fired from a dwarvish windlance. At the end of the previous movie, Gaston gave his single black arrow to his son so that he could go and assault the town guard. He has now escaped from prison and put himself in immense danger so that he can fire a couple of shots at Smaug with a bow. He may as well be using a water pistol. I have no idea why he's doing this. Meanwhile, Gaston's children notice their father in the bell tower, and I now know precisely why he is doing this.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Kili notices that one of Gaston's arrows successfully hits Smaug, but Ladylas says,
These arrows cannot pierce its hide. I fear nothing will.
Okay, so this is what I like to call a clunky as balls setup. Multiple things have just happened so as to allow Gaston's son to have his hero moment. Gaston escaped from prison. Gaston chose to climb the bell tower to shoot Smaug with his bow, knowing that it would be ineffective. The boat was near enough to the bell tower for them to see him doing this. Ladylas reminded everyone that a normal arrow cannot pierce Smaug's hide, which everyone in the boat is already well aware of. This then prompts Gaston's son to leave the boat and thereby risk his life to obtain the black arrow and bring it to his father. What should have happened is that upon breaking out of prison, Gaston would immediately try to locate the black arrow. Unfortunately, this can't happen because everyone has forgotten that black arrows are necessary to kill Smaug until Ladylas reminds them. The purpose of this is that the black arrows were set up in the previous movie, and the writers do not trust that the audience has a functional memory.
The people are retarded.
They needed to re-establish that black arrows are the only thing that can kill Smaug. A good way to do this may be to have Gaston's son be hiding the black arrow in the boat, and have the camera focus on the arrow while the characters are talking, thus making the audience question why the film is showing them this particular arrow, prompting them to then remember what the black arrow is. A bad way to do this may have been to have a mid-action scene flashback literally playing the line from Balin.
Only a black arrow, fired from a windlass, could pierce the dragon's hide.
So as to feed the same information to the audience once again in exactly the same way. A terrible way to do this may be for every character involved to also forget what black arrows are, only to then remember alongside the audience. So anyway, now that this moment has been set up, let's see how it plays out.
Leave him! We cannot go back.
What the fuck do you mean we cannot go back? This is a child, and you are abandoning him to die. Ladylas does not know why Gaston's son has left the boat. She is not allowing him to risk his life so that he can deliver the black arrow to Gaston. What has, in fact, happened, from her perspective, is that this kid jumps off their escape boat and runs into an inferno, and she says,
"Oh no!"
Their whole escape plan, quote-unquote, is entirely reliant on luck, so there is no reason why she, in particular, could not leap out of the boat with her insane elven agility, grab the kid, and get back in the boat. A way to fix this problem could be for them to actually have a plan of escape beyond... Let's go! If they had a strict deadline they had to meet, where they had to get through a gate before it closed or something, then this could actually provide some complexity to her decision. Ladylas could be forced to choose between risking the life of one child or risking the lives of 3 children, 3 dwarves, and herself. The obvious answer in this scenario would be to risk the life of 1 instead of 7, which I think is what they were trying to do here. As depicted, however, she simply decides, lol, nah, he's gone, we can't stop, bye. So anyway, Gaston releases his last arrow, and it has no effect, because of course it doesn't. Gaston's son then arrives, and Gaston says,
What are you doing? Why didn't you leave? You were supposed to leave!
When was this established? Did I miss the part where Gaston told his son to leave Lake Town? More importantly, though...
Nothing can stop it, no.
This might.
Gaston actually has amnesia. I was half joking earlier when I questioned why he climbed the bell tower with a bow and arrow, but it turns out that the reason he did this is because he genuinely thought that he could kill Smaug with a bow and arrow, despite the fact that maybe an hour ago at most he was running around Lake Town with a black arrow trying to get to the Dwarvish Windlands. So Gaston's son then hands the black arrow to his father, who then tells him to leave Lake Town and get to safety. Smaug attacks the bell tower, once again forgetting that he can breathe fire, and consequently fails to kill either of them, but importantly does prevent Gaston's son from leaving. This may sound incredibly minor, but Smaug not only failing to kill either of them, but also preventing Gaston's son from leaving, directly leads to his demise. Smaug then lands for the first time and addresses Gaston.
Who are you that would stand against me?
Gaston, still suffering from amnesia, tries to ready his bow only to find it damaged and unusable, suggesting that his intention was to fire the black arrow at Smaug using his bow instead of the Dwarvish Windlands. As a side note, unlike the book version, the black arrow is not actually an arrow. It is a large metal bolt that, as we have already seen, is fired from a wind lance, which is essentially a ballista. The prospect of firing a heavy metal bolt from a bow is sheer insanity. But I guess in this film, Gaston's brain don't be thinking too good. I, of course, cannot confirm the actual physical properties of the arrows he uses or of the black arrow itself. For all I know, the black arrow is made from the offcuts of mithril and weighs even less than a normal arrow. But as a point of comparison, a real-world arrow used with a longbow will typically weigh around 50 grams, or 0.05 of a kilo. A Roman ballista bolt would typically weigh around 26 kilos, which is 520 times heavier than an arrow. Gaston is essentially trying to load a Tomahawk land attack missile into a Colt single-action revolver. Anyway, Smaug taunts Gaston, telling him there is no hope, and that he cannot save his son from the fire. Gaston realizes that he cannot get to the wind lance, or perhaps that it has already been destroyed. He also cannot use his bow because it is broken, and also because it is the wrong weapon to fire a ballista bolt. So naturally, he decides to use his son as a bow. He jams the broken limbs of the bow into the ruined structure of the bell tower and says, "Boy, stand here, do what father says." And then he seats the black arrow on his son's shoulder and draws back the bowstring. Yes, this is actually happening. So this kid is about to have his jaw removed via some unholy slap in the face. And how the fuck do you aim like this? Boy, stand still, boy. A little to the left. No, not your left, my left. So the problems with this are so absurd that I am just going to list them. Firstly, physics. And don't even begin to try and tell me that physics don't matter. It's just a movie, blah fucking blah. It being a movie does not mean that you get to contradict your rules in this way. So, you cannot fire a ballista bolt from a bow. The amount of force needed to launch the bolt properly would be far more than could be generated by a man pulling a bowstring. Jamming the broken parts of a bow into a plank of wood is not anywhere near secure enough to store the amount of energy required to launch a ballista bolt. There is no way to accurately fire this by balancing the bolt on a child. Now, onto the character issues. Let's assume that firing a ballista bolt using a child and a broken bow is physically possible. Gaston's son being here is reliant on random chance. Gaston being here is reliant on him leaving his brain in the jail cell. Them being alive is reliant on Smaug being aware that Gaston is shooting at him, but consciously deciding not to kill him. It sure is a good thing, then, that Gaston's wife is dead, because if she saw this, she would go ballistic. Okay, I'll see myself out. Anyway, this scene seems to be an idea that sounded good on paper, but is unfathomably stupid on screen. The idea of family overcoming evil, the idea of Gaston literally using his son to fire the black arrow, the idea of the son helping the father do what the great-grandfather could not. Why they decided to have Gaston use his son as a piece of siege equipment to communicate this is simply beyond me. So, whilst Smaug taunts Gaston, he sees the hole under Smaug's wing where his ancestor Girion of Dale had managed to loosen one of his scales and thus create a weak point. Gaston's reaction is this.
You have nothing left.
So there are two possibilities here. One is that he did not believe the story to be true, which would make perfect sense. As I have already explained, no one could know that Smaug's armor was weakened in this way, and that he smiles upon realizing, holy shit, Girion did actually make a hole. Now is my chance, I can actually kill this fucker. Alternatively, and possibly more likely given the rather balked state of Gaston's brain, he did believe the story, but had forgotten it until he saw for himself the hole in Smaug's armor. He then smiles upon remembering, oh yeah, he has a hole in him. I guess I'll aim for that. Neither of these explanations work whatsoever given Gaston's actions so far in this film, so my assumption is that this shot happened so as to remind the audience that Smaug has a weak point in case they had forgotten. So Gaston releases the black arrow and it hits Smaug perfectly in his weak point. I would not have a problem with Gaston's accuracy if the rest of this scene functioned. We have already seen that he is extremely skilled with a bow, and it was heavily implied that he has been waiting for this moment for his entire life. I don't have a problem with Gaston being able to make this shot. The problems I have are everything leading up to him making this shot. Plus the fact that Smaug is looking directly at them, and as he has extremely good eyesight, he can clearly see what they are doing, and yet he doesn't care to protect his weak point that he knows exists. Anyway, Smaug has now been mortally wounded and he dies. 10 minutes into the film. If I had gone to see this film because of the awesome dragon on all the posters, I would have been an absolutely furious 8-year-old. And as Smaug crashes down from the sky, he just so happens to land on Evil McGee and his boat full of selfishness, because, of course, he is a baddie, and he got what he deserved. This kind of thing is meant to be cathartic, to create a character so reprehensible that it becomes extremely satisfying watching them get their comeuppance. This usually works best when the bad guy is outsmarted by the good guy. They think they have won, but they missed a key detail and have been intellectually bested. There are multiple examples of this in The Departed, which I will not elaborate on, however, because they're not directly comparable, and I don't really want to spoil the ending. Another example that is perhaps closer to The Hobbit is Aliens. Spoilers for Aliens, so skip forward to the timestamp on screen now if you want to avoid spoilers. So, Burke is extremely selfish and is willing to kill others or allow them to die in order to become rich, much like the Master of Laketown. He attempts to flee during an attack from the aliens in the film, much like the Master of Laketown. He accidentally encounters an alien during his escape and is killed, much like the Master of Laketown. So, why does the Burke scene work where the Master scene does not? Burke's motivations are fleshed out and understandable. We understand why he is a dick, whereas with the Master we only understand that he is a dick. This makes his demise that much more cathartic. Additionally, when Burke flees during the fight, he is actively being cowardly. He is letting the heroes fight and die while he runs away. The Master is also running from a fight, but so is literally everyone else in Laketown apart from Gaston. So I would argue that the Master leaving Laketown is not so much cowardly as it is sensible. Additionally, him being killed by an alien during his escape is unlucky, but it's absolutely reasonable given how many aliens there are and given that they were surrounded. The Master being killed by Smaug is entirely as a result of bad luck. The dragon just so happened to land on him. I assume that Smaug also squashed multiple other people as well, but as the film focuses on the Master, I guess we aren't supposed to think about it. Additionally, Burke's death serves as a form of poetic justice. He planned to get rich off the aliens. He is directly responsible for the deaths of everyone in the film. The aliens were born from his victims. He does not redeem himself in his final moments, and he goes out like a coward. His own actions directly led to his own demise. This is poetic and extremely satisfying to watch. In the case of the Master, he had no direct interaction nor narrative link with Smaug. Had he attempted to grab even more gold on his way out, and as a result of his greed he was then faced with an angry dragon, then this would work far better. As depicted, however, there is nothing poetic about the Master's demise. It is simply bad man get squashed. Meanwhile, the dwarves and Bilbo realize that Smaug has been defeated. Gloin then notices the ravens returning to the mountain, as was foretold, and Thorin does not appear happy that soon everyone will know of Smaug's defeat. He moves towards Erebor alone as the dwarves celebrate. Again, it is slightly vague as to what Thorin's mental state is here. The film seems to be implying that Thorin wants to claim Erebor and the riches within before anyone else has a chance to. This seems to make sense, although what role the Arkenstone has to play here is rather confusing, because now that Smaug is dead, Thorin does not actually need the Arkenstone, because he no longer needs the assistance of any of the other dwarven kingdoms to retake Erebor. I assume this will all become clear soon. Okay, Balin does not understand when he is at fault. Ladylas lets children kill themselves. Gaston has amnesia, is actually an idiot, and exploits the bodies of children in the operation of broken siege weaponry. We then cut back to the aftermath of Smaug's attack on Laketown. We see the screaming survivors crawling ashore after having rowed to relative safety. Gaston's children are looking for their father, whilst the dwarves have decided to leave the survivors and head to Erebor. This may seem like a dick move, but in defense of this, the reason why Oin and Fili remained in Laketown was because Kili was injured, and the reason why Bofur remained in Laketown was because he was retarded.
Don't say that word!
Anyway, as Kili is no longer injured, and as the Laketownians are no longer in immediate danger, they have decided to regroup with the rest of their party. Yes, they could potentially be helping the peasants get to shore, but I think the best faith way to interpret this is that now that Smaug is defeated, they know that Erebor is up for grabs. They need to be with Thorin to reclaim their home. How 13 dwarves and a hobbit are going to hold Erebor from anyone who is looking to claim it is at this point unknown, but I digress. So this next bit I really wanted to gloss over because it's rom-com bullshit time, but there is unfortunately important character information within. Kili asks Ladylas to come with him.
I know how I feel. I'm not afraid. You make me feel alive.
I can't.
Tarim. Ambraline.
I don't know what that means.
I think you do.
I can entirely understand the dwarves wanting to get to Thorin, as Thorin is their king and he may be in danger or dead, or honestly who knows at this point. I can also entirely understand Ladylas staying with Gaston's 2 daughters to make sure they are safe, as they are, as if this even needs saying, children who have just gone through one of the most traumatic things possible and who believe their father and brother to be dead. Ignoring for the moment the fact that Ladylas was previously depicted as not giving a shit about protecting Gaston's children, the reason Ladylas is here at this moment is because she gives a shit about protecting Gaston's children. By asking Ladylas to come with him because he's totally in love or whatever, just informs us that Kili is at this point motivated entirely by his weenie. He is aware of who Gaston's 2 daughters are and what they have just gone through, and he knows that Gaston stayed behind in Lake Town and that he is likely dead. And yet his intention is to leave and take Ladylas with him. Anyway, because Ladylas has fantastic hearing, she hears Legolas approach, indicating that he did actually decide to come and help. Or at least that was my impression, until he opened his mouth.
What do we know?
He tells her to leave Kili, as she is needed elsewhere. So Legolas was last seen chasing Bolg. He did not notice, or perhaps did not care, that Ladylas had stayed behind. He has now realized that Smaug has attacked Lake Town, and he has followed the evacuees to locate Ladylas. He is intimately aware of what has just happened, and he offers no aid whatsoever. He intends to leave immediately with Ladylas. Kili turns away to join the other dwarves before offering her the talisman that he was playing with when they first met. I would forgive you for not recalling, but this talisman was a token given to Kili by his mother so that he would remember his promise to return to her. He has now given it to Ladylas, and the implication is that he intends to return to Ladylas instead, as this is the symbolic purpose of the talisman. The problem with this is that by passing the talisman to Ladylas, and thereby promising to return to her, he has symbolically let go of his promise to return to his mother. Maybe his mother is dead, in which case this would make marginally more sense, but as this is not in the film, it appears as though Kili cares more about excavating Ladylas' sinkhole than returning home to his mother after a dangerous quest. In amongst all this, Greasebag is behaving like an exaggerated cartoon person because the fuck else were you expecting?
Why me? Give me one of them. I'll catch my death in this cold.
This is, again, in line with what we have seen this character do. The problem is that this scene depicts the survivors of a dragon attack trying desperately to find their loved ones after having just seen their homes turn to ash. It also depicts 2 doomed would-be lovers going their separate ways. This scene is clearly supposed to be tragic, and if not for the inclusion of this clown screaming about how selfish he is, it may potentially have been emotionally effective. It is entirely possible to have a scene that is both tragic and darkly comedic, but this scene in The Hobbit instead should be tragic, and in its inexplicable attempts to be funny, it ends up being extremely cringy and tone-deaf. So, Greasebag assaults the peasants and declares himself to be in charge as the master is missing. Greasebag evidently genuinely thinks that he can be in charge purely because he says so. He has no means by which to enforce his will upon the people, and he knows that they do not like him. The master is not present, and neither are any of the town guards. He seems to behave as he does so as to allow Gaston to embarrass and emasculate him. He is seemingly incapable of cognition. He is incomprehensibly stupid, and I can't believe that anyone with a functioning brain would ever behave in this way. Greasebag does not know things. He does not react to things. He simply opens his mouth, and the will of the writers is blasted into our ears. The purpose of this scene is to show us an impossibly reprehensible character being as evil as is comprehensible, so that we can be entertained when bad things happen to him. So, he attempts to take a blanket from this woman who refuses, saying,
I'll be dead before I answer the likes of you.
Which is a very odd thing to say when she has presumably taken orders from the master for her entire life, and the master isn't exactly an improvement over Greasebag. Greasebag then declares his intent to murder her and moves to strike her, but his hand is seized by Gaston.
I wouldn't go turn him on your own, Alfred.
So, Gaston escaped Lake Town after using his son as a siege weapon and is now reunited with his family, and with impeccable timing, otherwise I guess Greasebag would have murdered this poor woman in front of everyone, and proclaimed himself to be the new master. This man claims to have seen everything that happened in Lake Town and declares,
He brought the beast down! Shot him dead with a black arrow!
This causes the people to embrace Gaston as their hero. How much more impactful would this moment have been if Gaston was just some guy who stepped up to the challenge in order to protect his family and friends? We will, unfortunately, never know. What we have here is Hero McHeroface, who is the town hero and fights against oppression, gives food to the poor and beats up the baddies, and when the dragon attacks, he then decides to save the town by fulfilling his destiny and defeating it. Because, as was set up in his second scene, Gaston is the town hero.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Then we get some more cringe.
Oh, hail to the Dragon Slayer! Oh, hail, King Bad!
Honestly, you know how much I despise this character, and I have already skipped things that are so surface level that a 3-year-old could tell you all there is to know about them. But unfortunately, there are so many problems with this scene that I can't ignore it. Greasebag declares Gaston to be the king of Lake Town. Firstly, Lake Town doesn't have a king, it has a master. Additionally, even if we assume that Greasebag has the power to declare a new king, he does not know that the master is dead, so he has no reason to want to replace him. Additionally, both Greasebag and Gaston seem to think that killing a dragon makes you the king. Gaston responds,
Do not call me that. I'm not the master of this town.
as if he knows that when you kill the dragon, you become the king. When a more normal response may have been, what the fuck are you talking about? Why am I suddenly a king? I know I killed the dragon, but what does that have to do with anything? Additionally, as we will soon see, Lake Town has been absolutely annihilated. So whilst, yes, Gaston did indeed kill the dragon, it is unclear as to how many lives he actually saved. So, after asking where the master is, this woman from earlier tells Gaston that he is halfway down the Anduin.
What?
Anyone at all familiar with a map of Middle-Earth will be able to tell you that the river Anduin is on the other side of Mirkwood. The river upon which the lake upon which Lake Town sits is the Selduin. This means that the writers wanted to name-drop a river that was featured in The Lord of the Rings, as the Anduin is the river that the Fellowship rose down after leaving Lothlorien, and it is also the river upon which Osgiliath is located, and in so doing made this woman an idiot who doesn't know where she lives.
Are you retarded?
Anyway, Greasebag continues to act like Greasebag so as to allow Hero McHeroface to show how brave and righteous he is.
To empty the treasury.
No, I tried to stop him. I begged, I pleaded. I said, Master, no! Think of the children. Will nobody think of the children?
And so, he takes charge of the people of Lake Town, and they depart for Erebor to ask Thorin to honor their deal. Alright, Kili does not care about children. Ladylas cares about children. Greasebag is evil, says things that make no sense because it sets up other people saying things in response, is spineless, and is a liar. Gaston does not want to be a king, and will lead the people out of necessity. We then cut to Fili, Kili, Bofur, and Oin arriving at Erebor. All they know at this point is that Smaug was awoken and has since been killed. All of their companions being dead is not off the table for them at this point. They see some of the destruction Smaug has caused and walk through the front door. Hey, imagine that. They make it quite far into Erebor before Bilbo approaches them, and I am possibly naively expecting Bilbo to have some kind of purpose within this film beyond, and then he rescues the dwarves.
You need to leave. We all need to leave. I've tried talking to him, but he won't listen. Thorin, he's been down there for days. He doesn't sleep. He barely eats. He's not been himself.
Because remember, children, Thorin has the crazies. He is being driven mad by the Arkenstone, maybe. Or is it the gold pile? Yeah, maybe. Is it his genetic? Maybe. Is it a curse upon Erebor itself? Seemingly, it is some combination of the above. Anyway, Bilbo claims Thorin has been down there for days, which doesn't entirely line up at all. It was not days ago that Smaug was released. Smaug attacked Lake Town and was defeated within one night. The dwarves and the other survivors reached the shore seemingly the next morning, and we already know that Erebor can be reached from Lake Town within a day. Given that Fili, Kili, Bofur, and Oin have no reason at all to take their time, this scene is taking place at most 48 hours after the end of the previous film. Anyway, upon hearing Bilbo say that a sickness lies upon this place, they rush off to help Thorin, either implying that they are well aware of what happened to Thror and thus want to prevent this from happening to Thorin, or implying that Fili and Kili now have the crazies as well. So, they reach the Mountain of Cash and see...
gold beyond measure.
Thorin, despite being mentally frazzled, welcomes them to Erebor, and they decide, yeah, okay, Thorin's totally fine, even though he is currently walking around telling himself how much he likes gold, suggesting that either Fili and Kili are unaware of the gold sickness that runs in their own family, or that they are also afflicted, or perhaps that they do indeed notice that their uncle is now a fruitcake and have decided to ignore it. None of these hypotheses are ever addressed in this film. The only two dwarves to even acknowledge that Thorin is going mad are Dwalin and Balin, and even then only after a significant amount of time spent swimming in Thorin's gold-plated bullshit. We then get some revisionist history. Before I show you what happens, I will remind you of what we saw happen in the previous film. Bilbo and Smaug accidentally ended up right next to the Arkenstone. Both characters were aware of what the Arkenstone was. Smaug said to Bilbo, I am almost tempted to let you take it if only to see Oakenshield suffer. Watch it destroy him, watch it corrupt his heart and drive him mad. But I think not. I think our little game ends here. So tell me, thief, how do you choose to die? Bilbo then puts the ring on, becoming invisible, and upon realizing that Bilbo has disappeared once more, Smaug sprays fire everywhere. Now, here's what the Battle of the Five Armies wants you to think is what happened in that scene. Bilbo puts the ring on and is able to grab the Arkenstone and escape before being engulfed in fire.
Nope!
Additionally, this scene confuses the rules of the ring. When someone puts the ring on, they become invisible, including anything they are wearing. How exactly it knows to make your clothes invisible is unknown, but until now, this is a question that was never relevant. The specific mechanics of how the ring does what it does have never been problematic. Until now. This scene implies that when you put the ring on, anything you pick up also becomes invisible. The reason this is implied is because we already know that Smaug knows that the Arkenstone is there, and he knows that Bilbo wants it, and yet he is unable to prevent Bilbo from taking it. Had Invisibilbo picked up the Arkenstone and it remained visible, Smaug would have abso-fucking-lutely been able to see it, and this would then make Bilbo's escape even more absurd than it already is. So, why did the writers make this choice? Why conceal from the audience whether or not Bilbo has the Arkenstone? There are a couple of reasons. One is to provide an additional cliffhanger going into film 3, as this is a significant unanswered question. 2 is to prevent Bilbo from telling Thorin, no, I couldn't get it, sorry, as Bilbo is not a liar, and to therefore allow Thorin to suspect that Bilbo is hiding something from him and justify his paranoia. The problem is that narratively this was entirely unnecessary. I know that I have already pointed out multiple problems and inconsistencies with Thorin's crazies, but for now, I'll just accept what the writers wanted to convey. Thorin was already acting crazy before Bilbo acquired the Arkenstone. Thorin then went back to not being crazy after Bilbo acquired the Arkenstone. The repetition of Smaug's dialogue,
watch it destroy him, watch it corrupt his heart, and drive him mad,
appears to be a direct attempt to explain Thorin's behavior. Thorin is acting crazy because Bilbo took the Arkenstone. Meaning that Bilbo is now stuck because he can either reveal that he already has the Arkenstone and risk Thorin's wrath, or he can keep it hidden, which honestly could lead to any number of things, few of them good. The problems are that this requires that Bilbo did actually take the Arkenstone in the previous film, which I simply don't believe was possible. It requires that Thorin be crazy and also not crazy as required by the plot. It requires that Thorin and Bilbo not confront each other after their initial standoff. and it requires that Thorin believes that the Arkenstone is still within the treasure hoard. Given Thorin's mental state, and given his extremely paranoid behavior towards Bilbo specifically in the previous film, and given that Thorin immediately saw through Bilbo's dismissive answer, all Thorin needed to do, which would have been entirely reasonable, was search Bilbo. Okay, Thorin really likes gold, trusts, but also doesn't trust Bilbo. And Bilbo is unwilling to call people out when they threaten to kill him, and doesn't trust Thorin. Cut back to the peasants, where Greasebag is acting like Greasebag. Right, that's enough of that. Gaston clarifies that his intent is to ask only for the gold that was promised to them so that they can rebuild their lives. He believes the gold to be cursed, and that he has no intentions of taking more than they were promised. This makes a degree of sense, and it is totally within character for Gaston. Legolas, it turns out, is still here, and he decides to have a chat with Gaston, warning him that something bad may happen as a result of Smaug's defeat. There are many factions who want Erebor for many reasons, setting up the core conflict of this film. My question is, why is Legolas telling Gaston this? He has never met him, he doesn't know who he is, he doesn't like outsiders, and he doesn't seem to care about protecting the Lake Townians. Therefore, Legolas appears to have waited around so as to tell the audience that there is conflict on the horizon. Speaking of conflict, Azog and his army of physics simulations march towards Erebor. I have no idea why the armies in this movie look substantially less believable than those in The Lord of the Rings, but anyway, Bolg approaches Azog and informs him of Legolas and Ladylas. I am happy to assume that Bolg was able to locate Azog. Bolg knows that Azog is leading Sauron's army, he knows that they intend to head to Erebor, and he knows where they came from. Plus, a giant army is easier to locate than just Azog on his own. Bolg tells Azog that the elves fled like cowards, which is, of course, the opposite of what happened, and Azog is not happy about this, saying that they will return with an army. This moment is absolutely critical. Bolg has lied to Azog in saying that Legolas and Ladylas fled, leading Azog to believe that this will prompt an army of elves to march on Erebor. So, why did Bolg lie? He hasn't exactly come across as a character with a fragile ego, and yet this lie is necessary for the plot of this film to function. It does, of course, turn out that there is an army of elves on their way to Erebor, but this is for reasons that are entirely different to what Azog has just been told. Anyway, because Azog does not want to risk losing Erebor as a result of Bolg's fuck-up, he orders Bolg to ride to Gundabad and to let the legions come forth. What and where is Gundabad? This was not set up whatsoever. Gundabad has been mentioned once in this trilogy.
He's a Gundabad wags.
So, the sudden reveal that they have a Gundabad raises more than a few questions. Why were the orcs in Gundabad not already a part of this fight? Did Sauron not want them? Why did the Gundabad orcs not already have an interest in Erebor? Where is Gundabad? All rather important questions, none of which are going to be answered at any point in this film. Anyway, what has essentially happened is that Azog has realized that an army of elves is likely going to meet them in battle at Erebor. So he has said, shit, what do I do now? Oh yeah, let's go and ask Gundabad to come and help. This would be like if in The Lord of the Rings, when Sauron is attacking Minas Tirith, Gandalf says, shit, what do I do now? Oh yeah, let's light the beacons and ask Rohan to come help. Then when the Haradrim arrive, Gandalf says, shit, what do I do Oh yeah, Aragorn, go to the mountain and ask the army of the dead to come help. What is the army of the dead, you may ask? Doesn't matter, they can help, you see. You may be thinking, but random, isn't this an extremely simplistic overview of exactly what happens? And no. Rohan's aid, the army of the dead, and the Haradrim were all set up. The audience already knew who these factions were and what their allegiances were. When the Haradrim arrive and start squashing the Rohirrim, the audience isn't caught off guard saying, oh, I guess they have elephants now, where did they get those? Because the existence of this faction, and the Mumakil, was set up in the previous movie. Anyway, we cut back to Legolas and Ladylas. He tells her that he knows who Bolg is, revealing that Bolg is the son of Azog. He claims that Bolg fled north after leaving Lake Town. This creates a wee problem. So there are two possibilities. I had assumed that Azog led his army from Dol Guldur around the south of Mirkwood to then head north to Erebor, passing Lake Town en route. However, this doesn't make any sense if Legolas is correct about the direction Bolg fled. If Bolg fled north of Lake Town, It means he went this way around Mirkwood. He met Azog's army en route, meaning that Azog was in fact heading north out of Dol Guldur to approach Erebor from the west. So why make such a big deal out of this? Well, this matters because the recently introduced Gundabad is located right about here. This means Azog intended to lead his army right past Gundabad, but had no intentions of joining forces or ordering them to send their own army, despite the fact that from what we have been explicitly told, it is quite likely that Azog and Bolg are from Gundabad originally. Sauron's forces and the Gundabad orcs are already working together, meaning that this makes absolutely no sense unless they plan to hold back their forces at Gundabad for some reason, and then decided actually we need to call in our strategic reserves. This may be explained somewhere in the book, but as depicted in the film, it comes off as if they waited until film 3 to introduce Gundabad as a faction because they remembered that there need to be 5 armies in the Battle of the Five Armies. So Legolas explains to Ladylas what and where Gundabad is, because being a millennia-old elven captain, she is completely unaware of an ancient orc stronghold that lies less than 300 miles from her home.
Dumb bitch.
An elven messenger then approaches Legolas. How the messenger knew where to find him is a mystery, but honestly, for this video to remain in any way digestible, I'm going to have to gloss over problems as minor as this. The messenger says that Thranduil has summoned Legolas to return to the Woodland Realm immediately, and that Ladylas has been banished. Legolas tells the messenger that if Ladylas cannot return, then neither will he, and we fall back into rom-com bullshit time. He then says that he will ride north to Gundabad and asks her to come with him. So this appears to suggest that Legolas wants to go to Gundabad, and that this is the reason for him disobeying his father. He is not simply refusing on a matter of principle. He has an objective, and returning to Mirkwood does not align with this objective. Excellent. So my question then is, why does Legolas want to ride to Gundabad? The film thinks it has done a sufficient job of explaining this, but it absolutely has not. The dialogue in this scene has tricked the audience into thinking that this makes sense. Legolas's one single reason to ride 300 miles away from Erebor to Gundabad is that Bolg is from there. That's it. Does Legolas desperately want to murder Bolg? It can't be that simple, because Legolas evidently stopped chasing him at some point so that he could return here and then start chasing him again. Does Legolas suspect that Bolg may lead the Gundabad orcs into battle, and he believes that he can prevent this by challenging Bolg to pistols at dawn? Is Legolas just making up reasons not to return to Mirkwood so that he can have an adventure with Ladylas? I don't know anymore. I have absolutely no idea what Legolas plans to do when he arrives at Gundabad. He does not have an objective or a reason for going there, and I can only assume this happens so as to allow the plot to progress later down the line. Okay, Gaston is honorable. Greasebag hates women, hates working, likes gold. Bolg doesn't want his papa to know how bad he sucks. Ladylas is inexperienced with Middle-Earth despite being an elf who is potentially thousands of years old. And Legolas prioritizes love over obeying his father and king. We then cut back to Dol Guldur, which now appears empty. Gandalf is still imprisoned. The last movie did rather irritatingly invent out of nowhere that Gandalf is capable of teleportation, but I am happy to assume that he needs his staff in order to do this, as we have never seen Gandalf perform magical feats without his staff. He then hears Galadriel's voice in his head.
You are not alone, Mithrandir, Ilialithon, Imdulithon.
And this is something that has happened multiple times in both The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit. A power that Galadriel has is that she is able to communicate with people telepathically. In The Fellowship of the Ring, she speaks to Frodo when he arrives in Lothlorien, but before he has actually met her. She is aware that he is carrying the ring, and she was also aware that Gandalf had fallen into shadow, without anyone telling her. In Return of the King, we also have her voiceover when Frodo is attacked by Shelob.
I give you the light of Erendir. May it be a light for you in dark places when all other lights go out.
And I don't think that Galadriel is literally communicating with Frodo here, given that the dialogue is identical to the scene in Fellowship.
I give you the light of Erendir. May it be a light for you in dark places when all other lights go out.
This scene is instead a visual representation of Frodo recalling that he has the Light of Elendil, and it is of course also here to remind the audience that Frodo has the Light of Elendil. I usually dislike when films do this, look no further than my previous rant about the Black Arrow, but honestly, given the length of these movies, the Shelob scene occurs at least 8 hours after the Lothlorien scene, so I can forgive it. Anyway, the final example of Galadriel speaking to people in their heads is in the Desolation of Smaug, where she communicates with Gandalf as he enters Mirkwood.
Something moves in the shadows, unseen. Beware the necromancer. He is not what he seems.
This is the first time Galadriel has done anything like this explicitly. She is directly communicating with someone across a significant distance via some form of telepathy. This explains why she is able to do this now in the Battle of the Five Armies, although it raises multiple questions across the 6 films. If Galadriel is suddenly able to speak to people on the other side of Middle-Earth, this, combined with the fact that she can read minds, means that there are many instances where doing so would have been extremely useful. Again, this is probably a topic for another video, as if I were to even try and list them now, this video would never be released. The only defense I can think of is that she is only able to do this with other beings of immense power, such as Gandalf. To summarize then, the Hobbit movies inventing this ability for Galadriel has the potential to create multiple holes in The Lord of the Rings. Anyway, we see Gandalf moping in his cage in Dol Guldur, lamenting the fact that he ran in on his own and was almost immediately apprehended and placed in a location tragically bereft of butterflies.
Mission accomplished.
We see him communicating with Radagast, or at least that seems to be what is implied. And if I'm right about this, then this suggests that multiple characters in Middle-Earth are able to communicate directly with each other from across the continent. Yes, these characters are ones that have already been established as being extremely powerful, but forgive me for suspecting that the writers have decided to invent a new power for them so as to justify a dramatic fight scene in the 6th and final film in the series. Anyway, Gandalf is manhandled by a particularly large orc who says that Gandalf has something Sauron wants. One of the 3 elven rings. This plugs one hole and creates many more. This explains why Sauron did not kill Gandalf, as they are building on the idea that Sauron is trying to collect all of the rings of power like Pokemon. We already know he has Thrain's ring, and we also know from An Unexpected Journey that Sauron already has 2 of the other dwarven rings as well.
Of the 7 dwarf rings, 4 were consumed by dragons. 2 were taken by Sauron before he fell in Mordor.
Why Sauron is doing this is unexplained, and as I have mentioned before, is inexplicable if the rings function as depicted in The Lord of the Rings. Additionally, if Sauron's goal is to obtain Gandalf's ring, I can't help but think locking him in a cage, waiting for a while, and then asking one orc to go and slap him around a bit is not a particularly optimal method by which to do this, especially given how easily Sauron overpowered Gandalf in the previous film. As Gandalf does not have his staff, the orc is able to give him a reasonable spanking, and if not for the timely arrival of a certain character, Gandalf would have lost his finger and his ring during this scene. Meaning that Gandalf has been defeated. How much of this was due to his mental strain caused by his battle with Sauron, and how much was due to starvation and thirst is unknown, because we simply have no frame of reference for how much time has passed. Anyway, prior to entering Dol Guldur alone, instead of waiting for backup or bringing Radagast with him, Gandalf sent Radagast to get Galadriel for help. We have seen both Galadriel and Gandalf communicate across vast distances via telepathy, so why Radagast needed to physically go and get her is unknown.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
I don't usually ask that magic systems in movies delve too much into the specifics of how this kind of thing works, and in The Lord of the Rings, when this kind of thing happened, it didn't negatively affect the world building. When Galadriel communicates with Frodo in Fellowship of the Ring, this requires that she is aware of where Frodo is, what his name is, what he is doing, and that he is carrying the One Ring. All of which can be summed up by saying that Galadriel can read Frodo's mind and communicate with him when she is relatively close by. That's it. There is no, oh, but if she can do that, then why didn't she do X? Because this does not contradict anything. She is not seen to do this from the other side of Middle-Earth, and there were no other opportunities for her to use this ability. In the Hobbit movies, Galadriel, at the very least, can communicate with Gandalf from the other side of Middle-Earth, if not vice versa. And she can also read his mind. Gandalf is also aware that she can do this. Therefore, there is now zero reason as to why Radagast would need to leave in order to bring her to Dol Guldur. The only potential reason I can think of was so as to ensure that Galadriel knew that she was needed, as she may not have been reading Gandalf's mind at this exact moment, but even this doesn't work. Galadriel should already know what Gandalf knows, and one would think she would have her eye on him anyway, as she is very aware of the Morgul blade, and she explicitly sent him to the High Fells of Rudar. Okay, so setting aside how her arrival makes less than no sense unless we simply say, oh, it's Galadriel, she's really powerful, so obviously she knew Gandalf needed help, Galadriel is now here, with impeccable timing, and she vaporizes the orc, thus saving Gandalf. As she walks through Dol Guldur, this happens.
9 for mortal men doomed to die.
And they find themselves surrounded by the Nine, the Nazgul. This tells us that the Nazgul have remained hidden until now, as we already know that they have been here for the entire trilogy, or at least we can be certain of this with regard to the Witch King and can reasonably assume it to be true of the other 8. Because Sauron's original plan of asking one orc to take Gandalf's ring didn't turn out so well, he has decided to whip out the big guns and send the Nazgul. This partly works, but mostly doesn't. Firstly, Galadriel is also a ring bearer, meaning that as per Sauron's apparent goal of becoming a Pokemon master, we can assume that he also wants Galadriel's ring. However, Sauron is also here in Dol Guldur at this very moment. I have no idea how powerful he is in his current state relative to Galadriel, but if the Nazgul are this much of a threat, then I have to assume Sauron being present would only increase the likelihood of him defeating her. Additionally, the Nazgul seem to have announced themselves before phasing into reality, suggesting that they very well could have ambushed Galadriel while she was carrying Gandalf, suggesting that potentially Sauron wants to be discovered and wants to be defeated in this scene. I will come back to this idea shortly. Anyway, after witnessing the Nazgul implement some rather questionable timing, Elrond and Saruman reveal that they are also totally here now, and oh my god, it's Morbin time or something.
I just came.
Good god, that looks horrible. Anyway, we now get our fangirl moment of watching Galadriel, Saruman, and Elrond team up to fight the Nine. Throughout this sequence, the Nazgul appear to be some kind of ghost-type creatures, which is very different to how the Witch King appeared in An Unexpected Journey, and is also very different to how they appeared in The Lord of the Rings. In fact, if someone less familiar with Peter Jackson's version of Middle-Earth were to watch this scene, they would be forgiven for thinking these ghosts were something else entirely. They also seem to be able to teleport, and they seem to be way, way more agile and acrobatic than we have ever seen previously. Oh, the limitations of using actors in suits, am I right? This is kind of similar to a problem that the Star Wars prequels introduced, which came about as a result of advances in technology. We see that during the prequels, the Jedi are immensely skilled in combat. Then, a couple of in-universe decades later, Vader and Obi-Wan are now extremely slow and cumbersome when fighting each other. This, of course, is because their fight in A New Hope was made with a fraction of the budget that Revenge of the Sith had, plus the fact that David Prowse and Alec Guinness were 42 and 63 respectively, and creating anything like the climactic battle as seen in Revenge of the Sith in 1977 would have simply been impossible even if George Lucas had planned that far ahead. Is this the fault of A New Hope? No, although Revenge of the Sith's existence now retroactively creates this problem with A New Hope when absorbed within the entire continuity of the series. Similarly, the Nazgul in this scene appear to be much more threatening, aggressive, and flat-out dangerous than they ever were in The Lord of the Rings. This is honestly a problem in many other franchises, not just Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings. The alien creatures in Alien Covenant are vastly more agile, physically capable, and dangerous than the titular alien ever was in the original film. And yet, Alien Covenant expects the viewer to accept that the 1979 creature came about as a result of deliberately bioengineering the the 2017 creature into a perfect killing machine when it was already evidently far better at killing people. And, much like the creatures in Alien Covenant, the simple fact is that the Nazgul in the Battle of the Five Armies are entirely a product of visual effects. This meant that the filmmakers had no limitations in terms of what was possible with regards to their physicality. A couple of other factors will have also come into play, such as the fact that Hugo Weaving was 54 at the time of filming, and Christopher Lee was a staggering 92 years old, because this man was an absolute boss, plus my admittedly cynical presumption that this entire scene was added on short notice, and so needed to be filmed quickly, allowing no time for complex choreography as seen in Revenge of the Sith. Anyway, while Elrond and Saruman fight the Nazgul, Galadriel tries to wake Gandalf up, before Radagast and his goddamn rabbits arrive. How exactly they made it fully inside Dol Guldur is a mystery, and the Nazgul conveniently stop respawning for a moment so as to allow Gandalf to be whisked away. This also makes clear that Radagast decided not to help fight the Nazgul, likely because he does not have the skills required to do so. If true, this may appear to partially explain Gandalf's actions in the previous film.
On no account come after me.
But I will remind you that Gandalf also had zero reason to enter Dol Guldur at that point. Period. Anyway, Galadriel tells Radagast that Dol Guldur is draining Gandalf's life, which is a line that I almost didn't mention because it means nothing. It was not set up previously and it does not pay off later. It's just Gandalf has to go because Dol Guldur is really evil or something. So Gandalf asks Galadriel to come with him, and she refuses, opting to stay with Saruman and Elrond so as to confront Sauron. Why Gandalf wanted her to come with him is open for interpretation. Maybe he thought they wouldn't stand a chance against Sauron. Maybe he didn't want Galadriel, specifically, to die to save him. Maybe he thought Saruman and Elrond had it handled and he wanted to whisk Galadriel away on a magical journey. Anyway, because the fight scene is now finished, the Nazgul stop respawning and are, I assume, dead. But then, wait, they were already dead, so I guess they're now properly dead again. But wait, they're undead in The Lord of the Rings, so I guess now they're just not in the scene anymore because the script says the fight is over. So to summarize briefly, this whole scene came off like a shallow but flashy video game level. And I have to say, this is probably the best video game level from the trilogy so far. The scene looks pretty cool, and it is superficially pretty awesome seeing Elrond, Saruman, and Galadriel fight, as their skills have until this point only ever been implied. The problem I have with this scene, outside of the logistics by which it is allowed to happen, is that the Nazgul are totally different to the Nazgul from The Lord of the Rings. They are reduced to Ultron bots, brainlessly Zerg-rushing the heroes so that they can show off their flashy moves. If these were instead elite orcs or some other respawning spooky, then the scene would have worked far better.
But random, if they were orcs, then the White Council would have just destroyed them and there would be no tension or stakes, much like the Goblin Town scene.
We must be watching very different films, retarded alter ego, because the Nazgul aren't exactly putting up a fight. This doesn't appear to be much of a challenge for the for the White Council. They're just effortlessly slicing through an infinite horde of respawning bad guys. Anyway, Galadriel is now also extremely weakened, presumably as a result of healing Gandalf. And then Sauron. So this next bit I need to take slowly. Sauron could have appeared at any point, suggesting that he was screwing with the White Council by throwing the Nazgul at them. However, Sauron does not appear to have a physical form, and as stated in the Fellowship of the Ring, Sauron cannot take physical form without the One Ring. So why he reveals himself at all is a mystery. He tells them that the East will fall, that the age of the Elves is over, and that the age of the Orc has begun. This is a very interesting comment, as it suggests that millennia-old Elven captains are not the only ones with a very poor grasp on Middle-Earth's geography. We can also add this ageless demigod to that list. The East has already fallen. The East is where Mordor is. It is the West that Sauron intends to conquer.
Are you retarded?
As Sauron simply has to be aware of how powerful Galadriel and Saruman are, this suggests that he is risking his plan for world domination so as to taunt the heroes. So he then respawns the Nazgul, presumably because he intends to kill Galadriel, Saruman, and Elrond after having revealed his plan to them. And then Galadriel decides, yeah, actually I'm okay. Hey guys, do you remember this thing I did in the other when I was blue and it's scary? I'm gonna do it again, lol. So Galadriel evaporates the Nazgul back to being dead, again, and then she blasts Sauron over the horizon like Team fucking Rocket. Alright, so I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. Why is Galadriel a wraith-like spookster? This seems to be a callback to her appearance in Fellowship of the Ring, but the context here is entirely different. So I am thoroughly confused. Why is she suddenly turbocharged? If she is powerful enough to throw Sauron in the trash, surely Sauron should have been aware of this, thus making his decision to reveal his evil plan to them even more confusing. And, at the risk of beating an eviscerated horse, why the fuck does he want everyone's rings? Had he not been interrupted by Galadriel's arrival, Sauron would have acquired Gandalf's ring, in addition to 3 of the Dwarven rings, and...
Profit!
I hesitate to say this next part concretely, but I think we have more than enough information to confirm it if we are going entirely from the films. Gandalf would have been killed if not for Galadriel's arrival. Gandalf was already weakened from his fight with Sauron, and this orc was easily able to overpower him. Had Gandalf lost his ring, he would have been entirely defenseless. Sauron has no reason to want Gandalf to remain alive, therefore I think it's entirely reasonable to suggest that if Galadriel hadn't arrived at that exact moment, Gandalf would have died. If Gandalf had died, he never would have worked out that Bilbo's ring is the One Ring, meaning that the Fellowship would never have been formed, and the ring would simply have remained in Bilbo's possession in Rivendell, or at least until it drove him mad and sought a new bearer. The events of The Lord of the Rings are now entirely contingent upon Gandalf being retarded and Galadriel having impeccable timing. Then the scene closes out by further tying itself in with The Lord of the Rings. Galadriel has just banished Sauron to Mordor, but claims that
he will flee into the east.
Which, firstly, you just threw him east, so of course he's heading that way.
I'm special!
And secondly, this seems to suggest that the east has actually fallen. And thirdly, why does Galadriel think that Sauron will flee to the east if she just banished him to the void?
I have no fucking idea.
Elrond then says that they need to warn Gondor, making me wonder exactly what the state of Mordor was prior to the events we just saw. Was it exactly as seen in The Lord of the Rings, minus the Eye of Sauron? Was it hordes of orcs just chilling and minding their own business, waiting until Sauron comes back from his holiday in Dol Guldur? If so, why did Galadriel throw Sauron into Mordor instead of anywhere else? Did she have other options? Why was Sauron posing as a necromancer in Mirkwood if he already had forces in Mordor? Was his intention that his activities as the necromancer are not linked to Sauron? Because if so, he failed at the very first hurdle by revealing himself and the Morgul blade to Radagast. Would Gondor have already been very aware of what Mordor is and the threat that it poses? Book nerds, please fill me in, but my impression, going purely from the Lord of the Rings movies, was that Gondor had been keeping the various evils of Mordor at bay for a long time, not for 60 years or so. Additionally, my understanding of the Lord of the Rings would suggest that Sauron wanted to be in Mordor, whereas this scene suggests that he was only in Mordor because Galadriel threw him there 60 years prior. Anyway, Elrond suggests that Sauron must be hunted down and destroyed, which suggests firstly that this is possible, and secondly that they did not have the means by which to destroy him just now. My understanding was that Sauron's spirit is immortal unless the One Ring is cast back into Mount Doom, and my understanding was also that Elrond was intimately aware of this fact, meaning that his assertion that they can simply find and kill Sauron seems rather muddled. The scene ends with Saruman saying,
"Leave Sauron to me."
So this is quite clearly a fan service moment, as we already know that at some point between now and the start of the Fellowship of the Ring, Saruman ended up joining forces with Sauron. The problem with this is that Saruman, as powerful as he is, does not seem to be anywhere near as powerful as Galadriel, and yet he seems to think he can deal with Sauron all by himself. Maybe this is a ruse, and Saruman does not actually intend to defeat Sauron, but this honestly would raise far more questions than it answers, and because the scene ends before we can see Elrond or Galadriel's reaction, we simply have to take the line at face value. So, in conclusion, this scene is precisely what happens when you sacrifice internal consistency and character motivations on the altar of fan service. The way this scene is filmed, the way the Nazgul are revealed, the way Elrond and Saruman arrive, and the way Galadriel temporarily defeats Sauron are all constructed so as to maximize nostalgic feels. This is not at all unlike many scenes in Rings of Power.
The island kingdom of
Numenor.
I hate you.
This scene serves as the payoff and the conclusion to the Necromancer subplot in the Hobbit trilogy, but it also attempts to tie itself in directly with the Lord of the Rings, thus creating many more problems. If someone were to watch the Hobbit trilogy with zero knowledge of the Lord of the Rings, this scene would not come across nearly as bad as it in fact is. The contradiction of both Galadriel and the Nazgul's powers, as well as what happens to Sauron, would not be problematic at all. They only become so when acknowledging the Lord of the Rings in continuity. This isn't really a defense. This is in fact similar to a quote-unquote defense I have seen of The Force Awakens, where people will excuse many of the film's problems by digesting it as a standalone film rather than as the 7th installment in a 9-movie series. This is entirely up to the viewer, but I am unwilling to make that concession, as the Battle of the Five Armies is, like it or not, a part of a larger whole. Okay, Galadriel can vaporize things with her mind. Gandalf is not physically capable and requires his staff to do anything. Radagast is useless in a fight, and Sauron wants to be discovered, but also does not want to be discovered. We then return to Erebor, and we see that Thorin is immensely frustrated that they have failed to locate the Arkenstone. Remember, Bilbo is currently in possession of the Arkenstone, but he has not disclosed that to anyone. Balin asks Thorin if he doubts their loyalty, but Thorin seems inconsolable. All the while, Bilbo watches Thorin carefully weighing his options. Thorin then states,
"Know this. If anyone should find it and withhold it from me, I will be avenged."
Which tells us pretty clearly how far Thorin has fallen. He has gone from
"I have never been so wrong in all my life"
to "if you take my jewel, I will fuck you up." Bilbo then follows Balin, who appears distraught by Thorin's current behavior. He describes it as dragon sickness, saying that he has seen it before, presumably referring to Thror. Even though Thror's sickness had nothing to do with dragons, but fuck me right for thinking about this for more than a few seconds. So far, Balin and Thorin appear to have been the closest of friends out of the group, and now Balin is watching his close friend of over a century be driven mad, which he understandably doesn't appear to be taking particularly well. Bilbo then asks if giving the Arkenstone to Thorin would help, and I very much appreciate that he does this. By finding the Arkenstone and hiding it from Thorin, Bilbo has essentially meddled in things that he does not understand. I am willing to assume that upon fleeing Smaug and encountering Thorin, Bilbo either lied and claimed not to have found the Arkenstone, or that he gave a dismissive grunt so as to not actually lie to Thorin, but also to try and hide the fact that he has the Arkenstone in his pocket. Either way, this means that Bilbo made the conscious decision not to reveal to Thorin that he had the Arkenstone. With the benefit of hindsight, it is entirely possible that this was the right call. But going purely from the information he had at the time, his good friend Thorin had showed up, asked if he had it, and Bilbo at this point decided to withhold that information. If Bilbo knew at this point that Thorin was crazy, then, again, this makes a degree of sense. As depicted, however, I do not think Bilbo had nearly enough information to conclude that he should conceal the Arkenstone from Thorin. So, given that he made that decision alone, impulsively, and very quickly as Smaug was about to find them, that Bilbo seeks help now makes complete sense, and that he seeks help from Balin even more so. Bilbo thinks he is doing the right thing in concealing the Arkenstone, but ultimately he wants to help Thorin. Balin believes that giving the Arkenstone to Thorin would in fact make the madness worse. Balin is clearly reading between the lines here and seems to be aware that Bilbo has the Arkenstone. He also appears to place an exceptional level of trust not only in Bilbo's willingness to continue to conceal the Arkenstone, but also in his ability to do so. Balin has just voiced what very well could amount to treason in Thorin's gold-addled brain, and yet he is willing to defy his king in order to try to prevent his madness from exacerbating. I think this scene is pretty excellent, with one exception which I will get to momentarily. This is the first emotionally effective scene in the trilogy since Thorin and Bilbo's embrace at the end of An Unexpected Journey. The reason this scene mostly functions is because it is driven almost entirely by the characters, as Bilbo is reasonably and justifiably seeking advice from someone whom he trusts, and it also serves as character development for Balin, who is at this point evidently willing to disobey Thorin. Where this scene fumbles is in the further exposition as to what exactly is driving Thorin mad. Balin specifically refers to it as dragon sickness, which suggests that it is caused by some kind of dragon-related curse upon the gold itself. This seems, once again, to be contradicting or at the very least blurring the lines as to what specifically is making Thorin go mad. I think the best faith interpretation of everything we've had so far regarding the crazy gold is that large quantities of gold have an innate quality that causes their owners to go mad, as Thorin and previously Thror were the only people to have been affected. Within Middle-earth, this is colloquially referred to as dragon sickness because of the obvious link between dragons and large quantities of gold. The Arkenstone serves as a smaller, more tangible representation of the massive gold pile. The Arkenstone is the single most valuable jewel within Erebor and the object of Thorin's desire. So the movies seem to be treating the Arkenstone as if it is merely an extension of the wealth of Erebor, rather than a separate entity with a distinct purpose. The Arkenstone is, in fact, a specific jewel that was acquired separately to the rest of the wealth of Erebor, and it serves a purpose beyond merely being a form of wealth. Meaning that it is not untrue to say that Thorin is being driven mad by all the gold, and it is also not untrue to say that Thorin is being driven mad by the Arkenstone. This wouldn't be a problem if the films had been at all clear in how they communicated what exactly is causing the gold sickness. As we will find out soon, we will not find out soon. Anyway, we then see Bilbo playing with something, implication being that it is either the ring or the Arkenstone, and unfortunately Thorin approaches Bilbo suspiciously and demands to know what he is holding. This reinforces that Thorin has become exceedingly paranoid, possibly with specific regard to Bilbo. This makes sense given what we have been told about Thorin's sickness. However, the problem with this is that Thorin is willing to make demands and threaten people in order to uncover the Arkenstone, but he seemingly never thought to actively search anyone.
What is that?
In your hand.
It's nothing.
Show me.
Anyway, Bilbo reveals that he was playing with an acorn that he claims to have taken from Beorn's garden, and he tells Thorin that he intends to take it home with him to plant in his own garden as a memento of his adventure. This prompts a discussion with Thorin, during which his sickness seems to have left him, possibly upon the realization that he just threatened his friend Bilbo, who turned out to be playing with an acorn. This is also quite interesting as it shows us that the dragon sickness is not all-encompassing. Thorin seems to be entirely functional, provided the Arkenstone is not at the forefront of his mind. He is more than capable of having a civil discussion with someone about something unrelated. Upon realizing that he seems to be speaking to the Thorin he befriended previously, Bilbo attempts to speak, potentially to confess that he has the Arkenstone.
Thorin.
Thorin.
But he is interrupted by Dwalin. As Dwalin tells Thorin that hundreds of survivors of Lake Town have entered Dale, Thorin's face drops and he gets down with the sickness once more. So Bilbo is trusting, and Balin will not blindly follow orders. We then cut to the ruined city of Dale, where the peasants from the ruined town of Lake have taken up residence. Gaston has led the people here with the stated intention of acquiring the gold that was promised to them by Thorin.
Look, sire, the braziers are lit.
So, the company of Thorin Oakenshield survived.
Greasebag, having now decided to flip on a dime and serve as Gaston's greasy underling, informs him that the braziers outside Erebor have been lit, and Gaston takes this as proof that Thorin and his company survived their encounter with Smaug. It is unclear at this point how Gaston feels about this, as it is entirely possible that he had assumed them all to have perished, and that he was simply expecting to walk into Erebor, take what he was owed, and leave. Interestingly, he does not outwardly appear to be in any way angry about what has happened to his home. He warned Thorin of what his perceived greed would summon, and Thorin did not heed this warning. As a result, many innocent people have been killed, and Gaston and his 3 children could very easily have been among the dead. I would have expected Gaston to be absolutely furious with Thorin upon realizing that he is still alive, and thankfully, the film does acknowledge this perspective soon. He instructs the peasants to take shelter shelter in Dale for the night and orders Greasebag to take the night watch.
That's a damn stupid thing to do.
So Greasebag has greased his way underneath Gaston's devilish handsomeness because he is a slimy sack of shit that only cares about his own well-being. Greasebag has spent the entirety of his screen time in the previous film being an antagonistic douchebag to Gaston, inconveniencing him, threatening him, assaulting him, and ultimately arresting him for no reason other than that he had decided that Gaston is a troublemaker. I don't doubt that Greasebag would attempt to put his foot in Gaston's door so as to ensure he is not treated like the other peasants, as he wants to be a man with some amount of status, but what I take tremendous issue with is the fact that Gaston seems to have forgotten entirely who Greasebag is, and for some reason decides to trust him with taking the night watch. Throughout this entire film, in fact, Gaston's attitude towards Greasebag seems to be that of a mildly disappointed, "Oh you," as if Greasebag is his middle-aged son who just proudly announced that he scored 100% on the autism test despite not practicing for it. Yes, maybe Gaston thinks it will make Greasebag piss off if he gives him a boring job and deprives him of sleep, but the flip side to that coin is that Gaston is explicitly placing both his own safety and the safety of the people that have trusted him to take care of them in the exceedingly incompetent and exceedingly greasy hands of Greasebag McMonobrow.
Alrighty then.
What could reasonably happen here that would give us a further understanding as to why Gaston and Greasebag are doing what they are doing would be to have the peasants question why Gaston has decided to place any amount of trust in Greasebag. And Gaston could then respond with something along the lines of, "We're all in this together, he wants the same thing we do," or something. We then see the dwarves reinforcing Erebor's defenses by fortifying the rubble Smaug left at the front gate. As a side note, I made an error with my criticism as to why the dwarves did not use the front gate in my previous video, and I will address that properly when I do the final autopsy video. Thorin clearly intends to physically blockade the city, so as to prevent anyone from entering, despite the fact that Erebor only currently has 14 occupants. Kili takes issue with this.
People of Lake Town have nothing. They came to us in need. They have lost everything.
Well done, Kili, and by extension, well done, writers. Someone needed to voice this concern so as to challenge Thorin's values, and the fact that Kili was the one to do it makes perfect sense, given the fact that his life was saved, in part, by Gaston's family. This, combined with the fact that Kili is, relatively speaking, young, dumb, and full of cum, means that more than anyone else present, he is perhaps the most likely to feel empathy for what the Lake Townians have just been through. And Thorin's response is, well, to be honest, it's incredibly cruel, tone-deaf, and ruthless, but the idea here is, I assume, that the dragon sickness has not only made Thorin incredibly paranoid in his desire to locate the Arkenstone and protect his mountain of cash, but also that it has turned him into a cold and remorseless cockwomble.
Do not tell me what they have lost. I know well enough their hardship. Those who have lived through Dragonfire should rejoice. They have much to be grateful for.
This is notable because this is the only reference we have so far for dragon sickness affecting the afflicted person in a way that has nothing to do with the treasure itself. I can totally understand Thorin's paranoid behavior with Bilbo previously, as he is being driven mad by his love of gold so much that he is willing to turn on his friends. I can also totally understand Thorin wanting to blockade the entrance to Erebor so as to ensure no one else can take his gold from him. What is slightly harder to believe is that upon being asked to help the peasants of Lake Town, who are suffering directly because of his own actions, Thorin would reply, "Those pathetic bitches should be thanking me. They survived the consequences of my incredibly reckless and selfish behavior. Who are they to complain?" Subtlety is not exactly these films' strong suit. And as ever, the frustrating thing about this is that it had an easy fix. Balin, Fili, or Bofur could have backed Kili up and said, "This is our fault, Thorin. We did this. We need to make things right." They don't even have to mention the fact that Thorin promised the Lake Townians gold. This is simply a question of morality, and the fact that not one of the dwarves ever voices anything like this suggests that all of them are simply slaves to Thorin's insane whims. For the majority of their screen time in this film in particular, the dwarves are not a collection of 12 independent characters. They are a hive mind that acts collectively based on what needs to happen in any given scene. As I have already explained, not one dwarf present seems to be aware that what happened to Lake Town, and therefore the current presence of a horde of peasants, is entirely their own fault. Okay, Gaston has a very short memory and is very forgiving. Greasebag is greasy. Kili is empathetic And Thorin is a crazy butthole. We then rejoin the peasants the following morning, who are complaining about not having any food, claiming that their children are starving and that they will not last 3 days. This, strangely, highlights the fact that their immediate plan upon having their homes destroyed and livelihoods lost was to acquire money, when one would think food would have been higher up the priority ladder. Yes, money can of course be exchanged for goods and services, but as acquiring the money is by no means a simple exercise, I would have thought it far more reasonable that they at least feed their children before heading to Dale. Go fishing, go hunting, salvage what you can from Lake Town. You have options open to you. Anyway, as a reminder that this film came out in the before times, in the long, long ago that was 2014, Gaston behaves like a sexist pig and declares that the women, the children, and the wounded will eat first.
Children, the wounded, and the women come first.
He could certainly learn a thing or two from the writers of Rings of Power.
What happens to wounded and children? Wounded and children.
He then asks Greasebag if he has anything to report from the Night Watch, and he responds,
"All quiet, sire. Not much to report. Nothing gets past me. Except an army of elves, it would seem."
Well, fucking well, if it isn't the consequences of your own actions, you incompetent sack of meat. Gaston is now a broken character. He trusted someone whom he absolutely should not have trusted, and he did so for absolutely no discernible reason. This person behaved in an entirely selfish and incompetent manner, as he has done in every single scene in which he has appeared, and as a result, an army of elves have snuck up on the Lake Townians. This is already bad, but it's actually worse than it might initially appear, so let's take a closer peek at what has just happened, and bear in mind the information Gaston has. He has to know that his family were attacked by orcs. I know we didn't see this happen because we haven't really seen him interact with his family at all in this film beyond saying, "Yay, you're alive too, yay." But his kids were attacked by orcs yesterday. There is no way they didn't say, "Dad, these mo-fucking orcs were all up in my shit," meaning that Gaston has to be aware that there are at least some orcs nearby, meaning that the risk of them being attacked by orcs again is not zero. And yet, armed with this knowledge, he asks the least competent person in Middle-Earth to keep watch, when doing so could reasonably have led to the deaths of everyone in Dale. So, now, regarding the elves, Gaston asks Greasebag if anything happened during the night. He says no, and it turns out that there are elves here now. Elves who arrived at some point during the night or early morning, and have remained standing in perfect formation, waiting for someone to discover them. This is minor, but it amounts to an army of elves doing something that they have no reason to do in order to facilitate a dramatic reveal. Anyway, it turns out that Thranduil has led his army to Dale, bringing food and supplies for the Lake Townians. I think it is probably reasonable for Thranduil to have known about Smaug's attack, as his messenger sent for Legolas was of course rejected and sent back to the Woodland Realm. I think it is also reasonable for Thranduil to have expected the peasants to have moved to the ruins of Dale, as it is the most obvious location in their immediate vicinity. What is not reasonable is that Thranduil's claimed reason for being present is to help the Lake Townians, when him having the information regarding Smaug would require that his messenger travel from Lake Town back to the Woodland Realm, and then that Thranduil and his army travel from the Woodland Realm to Dale in a day? Distance and time, please stop forsaking it. Anyway, the peasants are extremely happy to receive the food, and Thranduil then says,
"Your gratitude is misplaced. I did not come on your behalf. I came to reclaim something of mine."
So this raises a couple of questions. Why did Thranduil say, "We heard you were in need of aid," only 2 moments later say, "I don't give a shit about you, I'm here because shiny"? If Thranduil is indeed only here to reclaim the jewels from Erebor, then why is he letting the filthy peasants swarm his food supplies? If his intention is to join forces with the Lake Towners to serve his own ends, then maybe this is a sensible move to make, but then it calls into question why he directly tells Gaston, "Fuck you and your peasants, I'm here for my gems."
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
And since doing the previous videos in this series, it has come to my attention that the white gems of pure starlight that Thranduil wants are not, as I had assumed, mithril. Some of you in my comments did explain what they are and why he wants them, but going purely from the film, all we get is that they are the heirlooms of his people.
You would go to war over a handful of gems?
Heirlooms of my people are not lightly forsaken.
This is, admittedly, far more of an explanation than I was expecting, but whilst it is sufficient, this was the perfect opportunity to delve further into Thranduil's character, and remaining accurate to the source material would have been a fantastic way to do this. Anyway, Gaston tells Thranduil to wait, unable to believe that he will go to war over some gems. He asks Thranduil to allow him to speak with Thorin, so as to negotiate the gems for Thranduil and the gold promised to the Lake Townians. The film then cuts away, so unfortunately we don't see the rest of this discussion. We simply have to assume that Thranduil was willing to allow Gaston, a mortal man whom he has just met, to negotiate on his behalf. Needless to say, this does not seem like something Thranduil would ever do, but okay, movie, whatever you say. Okay, Gaston is an idiot. He is way too trusting and avoids violence when possible. Greasebag is incompetent, and Thranduil is truly outrageous. We then rejoin the dwarves inside Erebor and see that they have finished blocking the entrance. We then must unfortunately bear witness to a dialogue exchange that is very reminiscent of the dialogue from Rings of Power, in that characters speak past each other without actually responding to or addressing what the other has just said. So, Thorin observes the presence of an elven army inside Dale as Gaston approaches. Gaston addresses Thorin respectfully.
Hail, Thorin, son of Thrain! We are glad to find you alive beyond hope.
Which suggests that he is willing to set aside his feelings on the matter and negotiate to the benefit of both his people, the elves, and the dwarves. Thorin asks, quite reasonably, why he is armed for war, referring to the elves, and Gaston replies,
Why does the king under the mountain fence himself in? Like a robber in his hold.
Perhaps it is because I am expecting to be robbed.
So here, instead of continuing to be respectful and addressing Thorin appropriately, he suggests that Thorin is behaving like a robber. The reason he does this, I expect, is because he cannot answer Thorin's question. There is no explanation he can give as to why Dale appears to be prepped for war, other than to say, give me what I ask for or we will kill you. Thranduil is pointing a gun at Thorin's head, and so anything Gaston says will be clouded by that fact. He continues that the Lake Townians and the elves do not intend to steal from Thorin, but that they seek fair settlement. Thorin then agrees to negotiate, rather surprisingly, and they discuss their terms.
On behalf of the people of Lake Town, I ask that you honor your pledge, a share of the treasure so that they might rebuild their lives.
This is more than reasonable, as if you recall from Gaston's perspective, Thorin is to blame for what happened to Lake Town. From Thorin's perspective, I have no idea what Thorin thinks about his culpability in what happened, because it was never discussed previously, and at this point in time Thorin is, of course, crazy. So whilst I totally understand Gaston not literally saying to Thorin, you did this to us, we need your help, as this would no doubt cause Thorin to become extremely defensive, I would have potentially liked to see a scene where Gaston discusses with Thranduil how he should approach Thorin. This would make clear to the audience how Gaston truly feels about Thorin, and that he is willing to set that aside in order to secure the best deal possible for his people. Anyway, Thorin's response is, again, uncharacteristically reasonable given that he is supposedly suffering from dragon sickness.
I will not treat with any man, while an armed host lies before my door.
And Gaston's response is that if Thorin does not agree to his terms, the elves will attack Erebor, making this less of a negotiation and more of an ultimatum. This next part I find particularly interesting. After Thorin refuses to bow to the threat, Gaston claims that his cause is just. His people helped the dwarves in their time of need, were promised payment for doing so, and in return they received ruin and death. Things are starting to heat up. Gaston has finally addressed the point that should have been at the forefront of everyone's minds for the previous hour. Smaug's devastation of Lake Town was Thorin's fault. If not directly, then at the very least as a result of his selfishness and negligence. The movies did not at any point force Thorin to wrestle with the morality of his quest, however, he has just been blamed directly for the suffering of the Lake Townians. As I have already mentioned, I can totally believe Gaston becoming emotional given what has just happened, and I can also totally understand Thorin's response. Thorin claims that he had no choice but to trade his birthright for food and shelter, that he does not consider this to be a fair trade, and that therefore he need not honor the terms. Confusingly, he then refers to Gaston as Gaston the Dragon Slayer, indicating that he somehow knows that it was Gaston who killed Smaug. How he knows this?
I have no fucking idea.
So previously, when Thorin was dealing with the men of Lake Town, he was addressing the Master. As the Master is not the one currently negotiating with him, I think Thorin can reasonably assume that the Master is now dead. How this adds up to Gaston being in charge because he killed the dragon is unknown, but in Thorin's defense, that is actually precisely what happened. So maybe it isn't all that insane. Anyway, Gaston argues that Thorin should honor their agreement regardless, because he gave them his word.
Why should I honor such terms?
Because you gave us your word. Does that mean nothing?
Gaston may not know it, but he is directly appealing to what I found to be Thorin's core principles. Thorin is honorable. Thorin keeps his word. After seeing his company standing by his side awaiting instruction, he refuses to negotiate any further and consigns himself to whatever the elves will throw at them. This seems like abject insanity. Yes, Thorin is suffering from dragon sickness, and the topic of the negotiation was that of parting with his treasure, so I can understand him being utterly suicidal and deranged, but I have a much harder time accepting that the other 12 dwarves would accept this without so much as raising a voice in concern. They are about to be attacked by Thranduil's Elven Army. There are 13 dwarves within Erebor. All Thranduil needs to do is bring a single ladder, and he wins. Thorin has just signed their death warrants, and none of them seem to care. There is a tremendous difference between being loyal in the form of bravery and being loyal in the form of suicidality. When Sam decided to accompany Frodo in his quest to destroy the ring, this was bravery. Yes, there was a substantial risk that he may die as a result, but his reason for joining Frodo was to help him save the world. When Thorin tells Gaston to tell Thranduil to murder them all, the apparent acceptance of this state of affairs from the other dwarves is not bravery. Yes, it could potentially be described as loyalty, but this kind of loyalty requires that all 12 of them be perfectly willing to die for no reason other than that Thorin said so. The only way around this is to suggest that they are so blindingly loyal to Thorin that they will do what he says even if what he says is die. And the problem with this is that in the case of Balin specifically, we have already seen earlier in the film that this is not the case. In fact, I'm going to elaborate on each of the dwarves here for a fun little exercise. I'm going to quickly run down what I would expect the dwarves' reaction to this would be, given everything we have learned about each of them so far. Dwalin would stand with Thorin no matter the danger to his own life. He is utterly loyal and proud, and at this point seems to place absolute faith in Thorin. Balin would attempt to convince Thorin that he is wrong. I do not believe that Balin would follow Thorin into a literal suicide charge. Fili and Kili, as Thorin's nephews, would probably do what their uncle says and not think too much about it. Ori would do whatever Dori does. Dori is, honestly, a coin toss. If today is nice cup of chamomile tea day, then he and Ori would probably stand down, but if today is cocaine hookers and underground fistfights day, then Dori would be leading the charge. Nori, I have no idea because he doesn't have a character. Oin, I also have no idea. Bifur, I have no idea. I assume you can just kind of point him in a direction and he goes that way. Bofur is also a coin toss because he is both sensible and grounded, but is also a catastrophic idiot. Gloin also does not have a character, so I can't call it either way. And finally, Bombur has two character traits. Firstly, that he is fat, and secondly, that he does not speak, neither of which inform us as to what he may be thinking at this moment. So, hopefully that little exercise adequately made the point that we are now 78% of the way through the runtime of this trilogy, and based on my, hopefully, comprehensive understanding of these 12 characters, I can only justify the present actions of 25% of them. I know staggeringly little about these characters. Imagine if we got to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields without understanding who Merry, Pippin, Gimli, Theoden, or Faramir were. Without understanding why they were doing what they were doing. That would be a catastrophic writing failure, and that pretty much sums up the state of this movie. Also, one final comment on this shot. I find it highly amusing that this is a very staged moment for the trailer or the poster or whatever, and yet the actor playing Bofur was either not on set that day or they didn't realize that Ori was standing in the way. Anyway, getting back to the film, Gaston returns to Dale and Bilbo confronts Thorin. Thorin dismisses Bilbo, but Bilbo continues that there is an army of elves in Dale and that they are all going to die if they go to war.
We are, in fact, outnumbered.
Not for much longer.
this movie. I am struggling. Okay, so whilst this makes the dwarves' acceptance of their fate make a little bit more sense, as they were presumably aware that help was coming, this requires that this crow managed to get from Erebor to the Iron Hills, and that Dane is able to assemble his army and march on Erebor before Thranduil is able to bust his way inside. With my understanding of the geography of Middle-earth, it will take at absolute minimum a week for reinforcements to arrive, making this a remarkably special plan that relies entirely on blind luck, fantastic yet impossible timing, and once again, the shattering of distance and time. And if that wasn't bad enough, it gets fucking worse. Forget for a moment the nature of the Arkenstone with regard to dragon sickness. What is the purpose of the Arkenstone? What is the purpose of Thorin's quest? Why does Thorin need the Arkenstone? Well, as explained in detail in the opening of The Desolation of Smaug and the scene in Bilbo's house in An Unexpected Journey, Thorin's ultimate goal is to retake Erebor from Smaug and return it to its former glory. To do that, he needed an army. To command the Dwarven kingdoms and summon their armies, he needed the Arkenstone, because the Arkenstone gives its bearer the power to rule over the dwarves. I assume this to be symbolic rather than literal, but either way, the reason Thorin needed the Arkenstone was so that he could summon the Dwarven armies to Erebor. And yet, Thorin has just summoned the Dwarven armies to Erebor, whilst the Arkenstone is not in his possession. This has once again broken the narrative of this trilogy. In the first film, we were told that Dane would not aid Thorin on his quest, and it was strongly implied that Dane will not respect Thorin as king under the mountain without the Arkenstone. Fast forward to the Battle of the Five Armies, and Thorin's plan to have Dane save the day therefore requires that Dane changed his mind off-screen for no reason that is ever explained nor even implied. One other possibility is that Thorin has lied to Dane in his call for aid. Potentially, he claims to currently have the Arkenstone, and he hopes that he will have found it by the time Dane arrives. Had this been made clear in the film, then it would have added that much more tension and urgency, as Thorin now needs to acquire the Arkenstone in the next few days, rather than a general sickness-addled desire for things that are shiny. And finally, on the Dane point, Thorin's plan also requires that Dane accepts that Thorin has the Arkenstone, and so immediately marches on Erebor. Dane evidently requires no proof. He does not require that Thorin meet with him prior, so as to assert himself as the king. He simply gets a bird that says, "Caw-caw, Thorin needs help, caw-caw!" And so he's like, "All right, laddies, let's go twat some elven pricks." So anyway, Gaston returns to Thranduil and tells him that Thorin has refused their offer. Thranduil doesn't seem surprised and sarcastically says,
"Such a pity. Still, you tried."
This doesn't seem out of character for him at all, although it does make me question, yet again, why he allowed Gaston to attempt to reason with Thorin. Maybe he thought it would be funny, maybe he wanted to drag Gaston down to his level of cynicism. I have no idea, because the writers decided not to elaborate. The scene ends with Thranduil stating that dwarves understand only one thing, and that they will attack at dawn. Okay, Thranduil is cynical. Thorin has insane plans that rely on blind luck and is clairvoyant, and Gaston is honorable and is not good at negotiating. We then have a montage where we see the Lake Townians equipping themselves with weapons from the Dale Armory, whilst the dwarves arm themselves with gear from Erebor. During this montage, we see that Balin is somewhat hesitant to put on his armor, reinforcing his wavering conviction and faith in his king, as we also saw a quick shot in the previous scene suggesting that he is still very much doubting Thorin's capacity as a leader. Thorin summons Bilbo and hands him a familiar-looking shirt.
You're going to need this. This vest is made of silver steel, mithril. No blade can pierce it.
Okay, so at first glance, I very much liked the fact that he has taken a moment to ensure Bilbo is as safe as he can be. He knows Bilbo is out of his depth here, and rather than just letting him sit in the corner playing with acorns, he decides to give him some armor that just so happens to also be of immense value to ensure his protection. Excellent. I hope the rest of the dwarves are also wearing mithril that cannot be pierced by any blade, otherwise this scene becomes rather silly. Actually, on second thought, Gandalf told us in Fellowship of the Ring that this mithril shirt is worth more than the Shire and everything in it. Meaning that the extremely paranoid, greedy, and insane Thorin has just willingly given an item of incomprehensible value to Bilbo. Thorin has just parted with an immense amount of wealth. This is not inherently a problem, provided someone addresses it, which of course they don't. Had Thorin explained that he values Bilbo's safety over the value of the mithril itself, then this would have explored the nuances of his state of mind, which is something these films seem to be allergic to. Perhaps the reason they chose not to do this is because if Bilbo learned of the value of the mithril, then this may have contradicted the Lord of the Rings, but either way, what we're left with in this film is a contradiction in Thorin's character that can only be navigated by simply saying, well, Thorin's crazy, so of course his actions don't make sense, which is of course not how being crazy works.
Having somebody making wild decisions that make no sense, that benefits nobody.
Anyway, Thorin declares that the mithril shirt is a gift, a token of their friendship, and that true friends are hard to come by. Then things get weird.
I have been blind. Now I begin to see. I'm betrayed. The Arkenstone. One of them has taken it. One of them is false.
So my only explanation for this is that Thorin is fucking bonkers. And I want to draw a distinction between crazy and fucking bonkers, because these are not the same thing. If someone is crazy, their actions may not make sense to others, but typically their actions will make sense within their own head. What crazy people do will typically make some amount of sense to them. Conversely, if someone is fucking bonkers, their actions will not make any sense to anyone, including themselves. They simply spin a wheel and do whatever the arrow points to. Thorin believing that someone has taken the Arkenstone and is hiding it from him is totally explicable paranoid behavior, or as I just described, vanilla crazy behavior. Thorin not realizing that Bilbo is by far the most likely culprit is nonsensical, or fucking bonkers. Thorin has known the dwarves far longer than he has known Bilbo. Bilbo was also unaccounted for inside Erebor with Smaug for an extended period of time. Thorin cannot rule out that Bilbo has lied to him, so why he has decided to confide in Bilbo that he thinks someone has stolen the Arkenstone from him is a mystery. In response, Bilbo says,
"The quest is fulfilled. You've won the mountain. Is that not enough?"
And Thorin's replies are muddled and confusing, although this was clearly intended so as to convey how sick Thorin has become. Bilbo even directly asks Thorin if the treasure is worth more than his honor, as by refusing to give any to Gaston, he is essentially breaking his word, and yet Thorin doesn't seem to care.
Is this treasure truly worth more than your honor? Our honor? Thorin, I was also there. I gave my word.
It was nobly done, but the treasure in this mountain does not belong to the people of Lake Town.
We have multiple references so far for honor being the single most important thing to Thorin. Honor is what drives him to do what he does. And now, as a result of this dragon sickness, Thorin has forsaken his honor. Rather than making him irrational and a bit erratic, the sickness has seemingly made Thorin behave in the exact opposite way to how he would usually behave. Okay, Balin doubts Thorin. Thorin now doesn't care about honor and trusts Bilbo more than his kin. Bilbo attempts to be diplomatic. Suddenly, Gandalf. He has arrived precisely when he means to at the city of Dale. It is mighty convenient that Gandalf arrives on the eve of battle, but then again, convenient timing is kind of what Gandalf does. Frequently. Anyway, we see the Lake Townians are training with each other in preparation for their impending attack, which makes sense as they do not appear to be soldiers. And then Greasebag tells Gandalf to piss off, believing him to be a vagrant.
Pointy act! We don't want no tramps, beggars, nor vagabonds round here. We got enough trouble without the likes of you.
Because he's a baddie. Anyway, Gandalf then has a chat with Gaston and Thranduil, telling them that they must set aside any grievances they have with the dwarves.
War is coming. The cesspits of Dol Guldur have been emptied. You're all in mortal danger.
Gaston doesn't know how to take this information, and Thranduil says,
I can see you know nothing of wizards. They are like winter thunder on a wild wind, rolling in from a distance, breaking hard in alarm. Sometimes the storm is just a storm.
Thranduil seems to be suggesting that panicking about random bullshit is kind of Gandalf's thing, and he seems more than content to put his feet up, drink some wine, and ignore the whole thing. At this point, this seems very reckless for Thranduil, but we soon get an explanation as to why he distrusts Gandalf. Gandalf, however, persists that armies of orcs that have been bred for war are on the move. Gandalf believes, or at least claims, that Sauron's hand was forced when Thorin set out to reclaim Erebor. The idea that Gandalf presents is that Sauron wants to control Erebor so as to assist him in his conquering of Middle-earth. There are a few problems with this idea, however. This does not explain why any of the previous revealing involving the Witch King and the Morgul Blade happened in the first film. If Smaug is working with Sauron, then Smaug could simply have allowed Sauron's forces inside Erebor. Sauron did not need to wait for Thorin to retake Erebor or to dispose of Smaug in order to claim it for himself. In fact, by waiting for Smaug to be killed, he has ensured that multiple other factions are also interested in claiming it when they would never have even tried had Smaug been alive. The fix for this, once again, is easy. Remove all references to Smaug and Sauron working together. Make Sauron also be unwilling to go anywhere near Erebor while Smaug lives. And now that Smaug is gone, he is merely another interested party to add to the list. Gandalf continues that Sauron never intended for Thorin to reach Erebor, which is why Azog was dispatched to kill him, confirming that Azog must have been aware of Thorin's intentions and therefore, one would think, could easily have ambushed him. However, this does go some way to explaining why Azog and his orcs were already hot on Thorin's heels in an unexpected journey. So, if Gandalf is correct, then this does indeed mean that Sauron's plan was to have Thorin killed and then take Erebor himself with a little help from Smaug. Why Thorin needed to be dead for him to do this is unknown. Why Sauron didn't do this at any point in the previous 160 years in which Erebor had been abandoned is unknown. Anyway, Gandalf then says that Erebor is the gateway to reclaiming the lands of Angmar, and that if Angmar rises again, then the lands of men and elves will fall. At this point, I was wondering where exactly Angmar is on the map. Maps, in general, have been tragically absent from this trilogy when they were integral to conveying distances, allegiances, and the geography of the setting in The Lord of the Rings. This very conversation could have been taking place with Gandalf, Thranduil, and Gaston looking at a map, which would have then made clear where exactly Angmar is, as well as Gundabad. Neither one of these locations has been shown on a map, but if we take a look at a map of Middle-earth, we will quickly see that Gandalf's suggestion makes zero sense. And before you start reeing in the comments, this does not count as drawing on external information. The map of Middle-earth is frequently seen in The Lord of the Rings and occasionally in The Hobbit. The map itself is canonical within the world of the film, so I am not cheating by doing this. So, Erebor is here. Also, Gundabad is here, right between Erebor and Angmar. So to summarize, Gandalf's suggestion is that Sauron wants to take Erebor so that he can reclaim Angmar, which is nowhere near Erebor. And he wants to do this when he already has both a stronghold and an army at Gundabad, which, as we are about to learn explicitly, is right on the doorstep of Angmar. Put another way, Sauron is marching his army from Gundabad hundreds of miles east so as to attack Erebor, and he is doing this so that he can reclaim Angmar, which is in the other direction.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
I find myself speechless. I don't have any theories as to why this plot thread was inserted. This utterly disintegrates with the smallest amount of scrutiny. It is possible that Gandalf is incorrect about Sauron's intentions, but given that Thranduil doesn't reply, "Gandalf, this plan is retarded, why would Sauron do any of that? It makes less than no sense," I have to assume that the writers either didn't know or didn't care. Given the attention to detail present in The Lord of the Rings, I am tempted to assume the latter. Anyway, upon hearing Gandalf's Tides of Doom, Thranduil asks where the orc armies are, as by Gandalf's own admission, he must have rode right past them. And then we cut away, because finishing conversations is not something that this film likes to do. Okay, Thranduil does not trust Gandalf's wisdom, is generous with his allies, and is suspicious. And Gandalf connects dots that don't connect. So immediately after Thranduil asked where the orc armies are, we see that they are digging a giant tunnel. Things are about to get weird, guys. Prepare yourselves. Yeah, man, who knew? I had forgotten the Great Earth Eaters too. I think everyone had forgotten about the Great Earth Eaters. I don't think one single person going into this film was thinking, oh boy, I can't wait until we see the Great Earth Eaters. I am not going to touch this until it actually happens, however. So what I think is implied by this scene is that Azog's army marched from Dol Guldur to Gundabad, and then got these Earth Eaters so that they could attack by surprise. This appears to make some amount of sense, except that Gandalf rode from Dol Guldur and evidently did not see an army. He has to know something is up. He saw them leave, he followed them, and yet he did not pass them. Maybe we are supposed to understand he told Thranduil and Gaston to prepare for an ambush because the camera cut away, or maybe Gandalf simply does not know where Azog's army is because he's an idiot. Anyway, we then rejoin Legolas and Ladylas, who have arrived at Gundabad. If you recall, their reason for being here is it's Gundabad. Ladylas, once again showing herself to be very ignorant of the continent upon which she lives, asks what lies beyond Gundabad, to which Legolas replies, the kingdom of Angmar. He explains a little of the history of Angmar, that his mother died there during a war, and that his father Thranduil does not speak of it. Now then, the writers seem to be laying the eggs required to explain why Thranduil wants those gems so much. We will have to see if the eggs hatch or if they get scrambled. Okay, the egg analogy doesn't quite work, I'll go back to using naughty words. Then they are jump scared by giant bats, and Legolas tells both us and Ladylas,
these bats are bred for one purpose. For what? For war.
I know I've highlighted Ladylas's surprising lack of knowledge given her rank and potential age, but I don't exactly know how reasonable it is for her to know what a Gundabat is, so I can't really hold this against her. We then see that Bolg is here, after having been sent to Gundabad by Azog so as to bring forth the legions. And then the legions come forth. The only reason why the heroes now know about a surprise second army is because Legolas decided to go to Gundabad for absolutely no reason, and as a result was lucky enough to discover the existence of a surprise fifth army. This is, of course, not character-driven, this is instead what we armchair critics like to call bullshit. Okay, Legolas is incredibly lucky, and Ladylas is ignorant and inexperienced. We then cut back to Erebor, and we see that Bilbo is skulking about. He fastens a rope to the front gate, indicating his intent to leave, presumably so as to attempt to convince the men and elves not to attack, and to avoid needless bloodshed. He is then interrupted by Bofur, a character whom I both like and despise.
You should be inside. Out of the wind.
No, I needed some air. Place still stinks of dragon.
This next scene is pretty reminiscent of the scene in An Unexpected Journey, as Bofur has essentially just caught Bilbo trying to leave. Bofur believes that the battle will be over very quickly, and he doubts that any of them will survive. This tells us two things. Firstly, that he does not believe that any army is coming to help them, or that if it is, it will not arrive in time, and also that he is willing to blindly follow Thorin into what he considers to be almost certain death. He tells Bilbo,
no one could blame a soul for wishing themselves elsewhere.
Suggesting that he knows of Bilbo's intent and that he does not want Bilbo to die alongside them for no reason. This next part is, so far, the only part of the Battle of the Five Armies that I really quite like.
Must be near midnight. Bombur's got the next watch. It'll take a bit to wake him.
Bofur, I will see you in the morning.
Goodbye, Bilbo.
Bofur is explicitly giving Bilbo the opportunity to leave Erebor, and he is happy to do so, meaning that he is willing to defy Thorin by allowing Bilbo to essentially defect, but also that he is not willing to do this himself. He will fight and die alongside his king, but that doesn't mean he will force Bilbo to do the same. And from Bilbo's side, he attempts to deny twice what his intentions are, and only upon Bofur saying goodbye to him does he actually commit to leaving. Bilbo wanted the approval of his friend, and he did not want to disappoint him as he had done in the first film. This short scene is excellent, which unfortunately makes the rest of the film worse by comparison. So, Bilbo descends the wall and heads towards Dale. Meanwhile, Gandalf is arguing with Thranduil.
What do you think I'm trying to do?
I think you're trying to save your dwarvish friends, and I admire your loyalty to them, but it does not dissuade me from my course.
What the hell is going on right now? Characters are being explored, motivations are being clarified, conflicts are deepening. A stark reminder of what could have been, perhaps. So here we learn why Thranduil does not trust Gandalf. We learn why he planted a seed of distrust in Gaston. We learn precisely what Thranduil thinks Gandalf is doing. Therefore, we are able to understand very clearly what one character thinks another character's motivations are, and regardless of whether or not he is accurate, this is entirely explicable from Thranduil's perspective. This, right here, is character writing. If only other areas of Thranduil's character could have been explored in a similar manner. Anyway, having failed to convince Thranduil, Gandalf then confronts Gaston and tries to convince him not to attack Erebor, just as Bilbo arrives to inform them that the dwarves will not surrender under any circumstances.
This is the halfling who stole the keys to my dungeons from under the nose of my guards.
Yeah, that ain't exactly what happened, Thranduil, although I can understand that this is probably what the guards told you. Then this happens.
I came to give you this.
Gems. We soon learn that Bilbo's intention here is that they use the Arkenstone to bargain for the gold the Lake Townians were promised, as well as Thranduil's vajazzle. This certainly makes a degree of sense, as we can assume the Arkenstone to be probably the only thing Thorin would ever barter for, provided we disregard the fact that Thorin has already summoned an army and therefore does not have any practical need for the Arkenstone. However, by doing this, Bilbo will have utterly severed all respect Thorin will have had for him. Dragon sickness or no, Bilbo has just stabbed Thorin in the back. He has given the king's jewel to Thorin's enemy. Bilbo's explanation as to why he has the Arkenstone is that he took it as his 14th share of the treasure, which doesn't really make any sense. However, Thranduil and Gaston would not necessarily understand why, so Bilbo's gambit serves its purpose. He then explains,
Why would you do this? You owe us no loyalty. I'm not doing it for you. I know that dwarves can be obstinate, with the worst manners you can possibly imagine, but they are also brave and kind and loyal to a fault. I've grown very fond of them, and I would save them if I can. In exchange for its return, I believe he will give you what you are owed. There will be no need for war.
This adds a nice bit of moral complexity to Bilbo's actions. He has betrayed Thorin in order to save him. Thorin may never forgive him, but Bilbo evidently doesn't care. As long as his friends are not killed, he is willing to suffer whatever scorn Thorin throws his way. Leaving Gaston and Thranduil to deliberate, Gandalf tells Bilbo that he must get as far away from Dale as he can.
And I don't like to think what Thorin will do when he finds out what you've done.
I'm not afraid of Thorin.
Well, you should be. Don't underestimate the evil of gold. Gold over which a serpent has long brooded. Dragon sickness seeps into the hearts of all who come near this mountain.
These goddamn films can't make their minds up, can they? From what Gandalf has just said, the reason why Thorin is losing his shit is because the gold pile was brooded over by Smaug. This makes absolutely no sense. Thror was afflicted with the sickness before Smaug attacked Erebor, and additionally, Thorin is the one single person currently being affected. I am going to properly dive into all of the explanations given for the golden crazies when I do the final autopsy though, so for now, let us continue. The scene ends with Gandalf telling Greasebag to give Bilbo food and shelter, and to tell him if Bilbo tries to leave. A decision which will absolutely prove to have been wise. Okay, Bofur is extremely loyal to Bilbo, and knows Bilbo extremely well. Thranduil values loyalty, is not easy to fool, and is blinded by hatred of dwarves. And Bilbo is willing to betray a friend to save them. We then cut forward to the following day, and we see that Thranduil's army has massed outside Erebor. And is it me, or do they all look like copy-pastes of the same face? Also, these elves' movements are very unnatural, which maybe was intentional, as they are uber-disciplined millennia-old otherworldly beings, or maybe this whole thing was created in a computer. And oh look, Greasebag is being incompetent again. So yeah, Bilbo has left and Gandalf was not informed. We will see what happens as a result of this soon enough. Anyway, Thranduil and Gaston approach Erebor, and Thorin fires a warning shot. In response, the cartoon clones ready their bows, and the dwarves duck for cover. with the exception of Thorin. Either an indicator of his resolve or that he is fucking bonkers. Gaston then reveals that they have the Arkenstone and that they have accepted it as payment for what they were owed. Thorin believes this to be a ruse, to the bewilderment of some of his companions.
They're taking us for fools. This is a ruse.
And he declares that the stone Gaston has must be a fake. Right on cue, Bilbo appears and explains what he did. It may seem like I'm ignoring the fact that Bilbo appears to be teleporting from Erebor to Dale and back again without anyone noticing him, but I don't consider this to be a particularly valid criticism, as Bilbo is presumably using the ring to do so. As for how this was allowed to happen, well, it may appear that Greasebag was incompetent, because of course he is, and therefore Bilbo slinked out during the night. However, Bilbo, of course, has a ring that can turn him invisible. Therefore, it is entirely reasonable that Bilbo would have been able to escape regardless of who it was Gandalf asked to keep an eye on him. At first glance, Greasebag's incompetence is seemingly, in this instance, not actually incompetence. However, the filmmakers rather efficiently plugged that gap immediately so as to prevent any alternative reading of the scene by showing us that Greasebag has not checked on Bilbo for presumably hours, as he was surprised to find him missing when he brought him some breakfast. Meaning that there is no way to read this scene other than to conclude that Greasebag is immensely incompetent. I tried, Greasebag. I really tried to defend you here, but unfortunately the filmmakers gave me almost nothing to work with. Anyway, Bilbo reveals to Thorin that he took the Arkenstone, lied to Thorin repeatedly, and handed it to Thranduil. His reason for revealing this to Thorin is so that Thorin understands that he has no choice but to accept the terms and trade the Arkenstone for what he promised the Lake Townians, as well as Thranduil's glittery decoration. This tells us that Bilbo is willing to physically endanger himself, even after Gandalf's warning about dragon sickness, in order to save as many lives as possible. Bilbo explains that he wanted to give the Arkenstone to Thorin on multiple occasions, but that he reconsidered, as Thorin has quite obviously changed.
You are changed. The dwarf I met in Bag End would never have gone back on his word. Would never have doubted the loyalty of his kin.
Do not speak to me for loyalty. Throw him from the rampart!
Which brings us to the turning point for the dwarves. Their king, whom they were willing to lay down their lives for, has just ordered them to kill Bilbo, whom they all previously considered to be one of their own. This is the breaking point for them, where they are forced to make a choice. As one might expect, the dwarves refuse this order, prompting Thorin to attempt to kill Bilbo himself, as he is, of course, fucking bonkers. He is interrupted by Gandalf, who asks that Thorin return his burglar to him.
You're not making a very splendid figure as king under the mountain, are you?
This perceived insult causes Thorin to release Bilbo, and Bofur hurries Bilbo away, telling him to go while Thorin is distracted. Gaston then asks if they have a deal, the Arkenstone, in return for what was promised. Thorin is of course immensely frustrated by all this, and Thranduil taunts him, further agitating him.
Keep the stone, sell it. Ectelion of Gondor will give you a good price for it.
I will kill you!
Most of this scene, and honestly most of this movie, relies on Thorin being fucking bonkers and acting irrationally. It is difficult to make concrete criticisms of characters like this, because at this point, Thorin's narrative purpose is that he is insane. The deal he has been presented with is entirely reasonable. Thorin has to part with the gold that he already promised to part with, and also give Thranduil his bling that he claims belongs to him, and in return, he gets exactly what he wants. Thorin will have the Arkenstone. He will be accepted as king under the mountain, he will be able to command Dane's army to defend his kingdom, and he will rule over the dwarves. His quest will have succeeded. Unfortunately, Thorin is fucking bonkers and so will not accept a win-win deal. He would evidently prefer to die for what his confused brain considers to be a just cause. Anyway, Thranduil has heard enough, and the clones ready their bows. Seriously, I'm not even being facetious here. Look at this shit. They're all the same dude. Or perhaps the same soulless CGI abomination. Curiously, I see no ladders present, suggesting that Thranduil's intent, upon failing to negotiate, was to pelt the stone walls of Erebor with arrows. Actually, I'm not even sure they need ladders. We have already seen how agile elves are. Just swarm the walls and be done with it. The only reason this standoff is lasting as long as it is due to Gaston, Gandalf, and Thranduil's marginal preference to not kill the dwarves. As soon as that is no longer the case, this entire situation becomes absurd. In a final attempt at diplomacy, Gandalf implores Thorin to surrender, claiming that the treasure will be his death. Finally, Balin decides to be proactive, and he advises Thorin of the obvious. They cannot win. And then, because a crow is never late nor is it early, the crow returns, indicating to Thorin that reinforcements are on the way. I will note that this crow does not appear to actually be carrying a message, meaning that I can only assume that either the dwarves speak crow or the crow speaks dwarf. Okay, Thorin is irrational to the point of absurdity, and Bilbo is incredibly righteous and courageous. And over the horizon we see the arrival of Dane and his warriors from the Iron Hills. This means that even if I accept that Dane's army left the Iron Hills the very second the crow arrived, that he and his dwarves traveled approximately 200 miles in approximately 12 hours.
I'm wasted on cross-country. We dwarves are natural sprinters. Bullshit.
This is not quite as egregious as Galadriel teleporting between Valinor, Numenor, and the Southlands in Rings of Power, but it is, in a word, fucked. In response, Thranduil orders his clones to approach them. So now, relatively close to the end of the trilogy, these films have introduced a key character, Dane. We have never seen Dane before, and all we knew of him prior to this scene was that he was unwilling to assist his cousin Thorin in his reclamation of Erebor.
What do the dwarves of the Iron Hills say? Is Dane with us?
They will not come.
Luckily, the writers are able to use Bilbo for some justified exposition, as Bilbo, like us, has no idea who Dane is.
Who is that?
It's Dane, Thorin's cousin.
What are they like?
I've always found Thorin the more reasonable of the two.
Alright, so this is adequate, mildly amusing, and justified. Well done, writers. Although I am slightly unsure as to why Bilbo is still wandering around in the middle of an elven army when previously Gandalf's intention was that Bilbo flee to safety.
You must leave on the morrow. What? Get as far away from here as possible.
Anyway, Dane approaches the Elven Army in order to negotiate with Thranduil. He is voiced by the ever-entertaining Billy Connolly, and I am intentionally saying voiced by because he is played by a vaguely Billy Connolly-esque looking hideous CGI monstrosity. Initially, I chalked this down to poor time management or a lack of care, but having dug a little deeper, it seems to be a combination of Billy Connolly struggling with Parkinson's, which would of course have affected his voice and his ability to physically perform, as well as Peter Jackson changing his mind at the last minute as to what exactly Dane should look like, eventually opting to entirely replace him with a CGI character. I couldn't find any direct quotes on this from either Peter Jackson or Billy Connolly, however, so take this with a grain of salt. Weta Digital have, however, confirmed that although Dane was originally an actor in heavy makeup, much like Azog and Bolg, every single frame of Dane Ironfoot in the finished film is 100% CGI. I don't really know how to feel about this, as on the one hand, if an actor can't do the job, then you recast them with someone who can, but at the same time, it's Billy fucking Connolly, and his voice performance absolutely elevates this character way beyond what it could have been.
I have a wee proposition, if you wouldn't mind giving me a few moments of your time. Would you consider just shutting off?
Dane makes clear that he has no intentions of leaving, and his offer is a simple one. Leave or die. Gandalf informs Dane of the impending orc threat, but Dane insists that he will split Thranduil's head open if he stands between him and his kin. Unwilling to negotiate further, Dane returns to his army. Thranduil tells Gaston to stand down and says that he will deal with Dane. So, at long last, the shit is about to hit the fan. I will say that despite all of the nonsense within this film, it has done a reasonable job of slowly amping up the stakes by introducing the different armies one by one. I am tentatively looking forward to whatever happens next, although I am fully expecting it to be a broken mess of batshit insanity. So, Dane sends in the Goat Riders first, which appear to be lance-wielding dwarven cavalry. In response, the elves release their arrows and a volley arcs above the dwarves. And now, dear viewer, we come to the first of a few multiple choice rounds that I have prepared for you alongside my Discord community and YouTube stream chat. There are a handful of extended-only scenes in which something utterly insane occurs, so I wanted to give you, the viewer, the opportunity to guess what happens next, as more than likely most of you will not have seen the extended cut of this film. So, as a reminder, the elven arrow volley is arcing through the air and is about to come down on top of the dwarves. What happens next? Is it A, the dwarves release a counter volley of spinning artillery bolts that disintegrate the elven arrows? Is it option B, the goat riders tank the volley of arrows but don't seem to care, and they keep charging? Is it option C, the dwarves intercept the arrows by deploying arrow catchers? Or is it option D, the dwarves use a tuba-like device to catch the arrows so that they can fire them back at the elves? Alrighty, time's up, votes are in, the jury has made its decision. Now to see how many of you picked the lesser of the four absurdities.
Insane, you fool!
So, the dwarves have some magic spinny ballista type weapon that perfectly shreds the elven arrows mid-air before barrowing into the elves. Dane refers to these as twiddly widdlies.
How do you like that? The old twiddly widdlies? Haha, you buggers!
What is happening?
Where do I even begin? Firstly, this weapon appears to be 100% effective. Not one single arrow made it through. I think it is absolutely unreasonable to suggest that Thranduil was unaware of the existence of the Twiddly Widdlies. This weapon makes volley fire absolutely redundant, and the Elven Army seems to consist almost entirely of archers. Sun Tzu famously said, "One does not bring archers to a Twiddly Widdly fight." Not only did the dwarves manage to transport multiple pieces of heavy siege equipment from the Iron Hills to Erebor in record time, but they were also apparently able to aim and fire them in unison at precisely the right time so as to perfectly intercept the elven volley in its entirety. This would require an insane amount of foreplanning, but hey, I guess dwarves are just that good. So, in response, Thranduil does exactly the same thing again. No, I am not joking. He orders another volley, and the exact same thing happens in response because, of course it does. At this point, the clones form a shield line, which the goat riders then leap over. This would all be pretty cool to watch if it wasn't painfully obvious that this is essentially a physics simulation. I am in fact unconvinced that a single actor has appeared in any of these shots. So, the dwarves break through the elven lines as the company of Thorin looks on. And because something extremely silly is about to happen, let's take a break here and consolidate what character information was present within this sequence. Okay, Thranduil is a poor military strategist, and Dane is ruthless, single-minded, steadfast, an incredible military strategist, and despises elves. A loud rumbling is heard and presumably felt, and the fighting slows as all sides look on in anticipation.
Oh, come on!
You fools! You forgot about the great Earth Eaters. So I have a couple of thoughts on these monstrosities, if you don't mind. If a 500-foot earth-eating hellbeast can simply emerge from the ground anywhere at any point, then you can be sure as goddamned shit that people would know about them. Maybe not Gaston or Thorin, but Thranduil and Gandalf would absolutely not have forgotten about the great earth-eaters. The existence of creatures like this would change the fundamental nature of the entire fantasy setting. Erebor offers no protection against one of these things. Minas Tirith offers no protection against one of these things. The Black Gate of Mordor offers no protection against one of these things. This is akin to introducing a creature that can mind control anyone at any point, or can pick up mountains by looking at them, or can rewind time. You can absolutely do things like this, but not in the final film in the series and the third one chronologically. This entirely changes the rules of the game, and introducing something like this at the 11th hour simply comes off as a cheap way to allow for a cinematic moment. This is precisely as cheap as it would have been if Dane's army had arrived on the back of gigantic dragons the size of the Lonely Mountain. I can't prove that Dane doesn't have a collection of mountain-sized dragons, so I can't say that this is impossible, but I can say that had this been in the film, then it would have been absurd within the world the films take place in. Additionally, the worms go back underground so as to allow Azog's armies to charge out of the tunnels. I have no idea why the worms are not used in the battle. They could simply hurtle towards the elves and dwarves and they would be entirely unable to stop them. This would be like the Haradrim arriving at the Pelennor fields on their Mumakil, only to then dismount and charge in on foot. Come to think of it, they easily could have tunneled directly underneath their enemies, which would have been even more effective. Anyway, the reason these worms exist in this movie is so as to allow Azog's army to arrive in a dramatic fashion, so as to interrupt the ongoing battle between the elves and the dwarves. The only defense I can think of here is that the orcs don't like sunlight, which is why they decided to travel underground via some tunnels, but this doesn't work because we saw them earlier marching in daylight. So, as the worms emerge, Azog reveals his presence. He has positioned himself in Ravenhill, a ruined guard tower overlooking the battle. Upon realizing that there is a legion of orcs spewing out of the ground, Dane commands his dwarven warriors to charge them, immediately ceasing any interest in the elves he was just fighting.
The hordes of hell and fight to the death!
This is very clear, and I like this a lot. Or at least, as with many things in this film, I like the idea of this a lot. This tells us that Dane is extremely brave, reckless, potentially bloodthirsty, heroic, headstrong, and single-minded all at once. He no longer cares at all for his hatred of elves, nor his previous goal of reaching Thorin, because the game has just changed in a dramatic way. As the dwarves begin their charge, I see no sign of any twiddly-widdlies, so I assume they only brought enough for 2 volleys, which is both extremely lucky and extremely unlucky. And Kili at this point declares his intent to leave Erebor and join Dane against the orcs, but Thorin orders that they stand down.
I'm going over the wall. Who's coming with me? Yes!
Stand down!
There are a few reasons why he may not want to join Dane, but honestly, most of them are irrational, and entirely as a result of him being fucking bonkers, so I'm not gonna bother. At this point, we see that the elves have not moved. Thranduil appears to be letting Dane make a suicide charge, so as to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. As for whether or not Dane is aware that he is fighting alone is unknown, although I somewhat doubt that he would care. The dwarves then form a shield wall, and this next part I'm gonna simply show you and then dissect. Alright, I have a few things to say about this, so I will start with the good. In this moment, Thranduil has also decided to set aside old grudges, at least for now, and fight alongside his enemy against the greater threat. We can assume at this point that he believes Gandalf was in fact being truthful, hence his decision. This tells us that, when push comes to shove, Thranduil is not quite as petty as we had been led to believe. He is not suicidal in his disdain for dwarves. Additionally, in the theatrical version of the Battle of the Five Armies, the elves and the dwarves never actually come to blows. They are instead distracted by the arrival of Azog's forces. The fact that, in the extended version, the 2 armies actually clash beforehand makes their subsequent team-up that much more satisfying to watch. This is also, visually, very nice to look at. Now, the problems. Firstly, this scene was edited for maximum drama, but unfortunately, it doesn't work, because as depicted, the elves teleport. We see in these 2 shots that at the point at which the dwarves are forming their shield line, the elves have not yet moved, and the orcs are, given their speed, 10 seconds away from impact at most. This means that in order to allow for a dramatic and cathartic payoff, the elves traveled from Erebor to the front line in under 10 seconds. This is not possible. Now, for what I would consider the more critical point of concern, the dwarves have formed a shield line with pikes at the ready. I don't think I have to be a military strategist to say that jumping in front of the shield line is a colossally idiotic and needlessly reckless thing to do. This is almost on par with the siege weapons being placed outside of the walls of Winterfell in Game of Thrones. Given that we already know the elves are armed with bows, and given that they have only fired off 2 volleys so far, I would have expected the far less insane thing to do would be to pelt the oncoming horde with arrows. Although I suppose it is possible that Thranduil doesn't want to waste further ammunition before confirming that the orcs do not also have twiddly-widdlies. So I can't place the blame squarely on Thranduil here because we simply don't know why the elves did this. Well, actually, I can tell you exactly why they did this, because it allows for a dramatic shot that admittedly looks pretty cool. Unfortunately, much was sacrificed to facilitate this cool. This could have worked if we had the added context of Thranduil being a cold, callous, and proud military leader, one who does not care about the lives of his soldiers and only cares about winning and showing off to the dwarves how awesome his army is. Unfortunately, the only reason why the third act of this film occurs is because Thranduil cares about the lives of his elves to an immense degree, meaning that if we attribute this strategic ploy directly to Thranduil, then this is a blatant contradiction. I think the idea here quite clearly was to surprise the audience with the reveal that yes, actually the elves are joining the fight, after suggesting that they may not be. What actually happened, however, is that the elves disregarded their own safety so as to leap ahead of the shield wall for seemingly no reason. Anyway, upon realizing that the elves have joined them, the dwarves then also charge in. We then get this rather nice shot, which gives a very clear overview of the battlefield so that we can plainly see where each faction's forces are. Not necessary, but much appreciated. A lot of the ensuing battle is spectacle with little in the way of character information, so as to not get bogged down in the minutiae, I will give you an overview, but I will then slow down whenever there is something juicy. Azog sends in the trolls to take down the dwarven chariots. He then orders part of his army to attack Dale, whilst the elves, dwarves, and men are distracted. Gandalf and Gaston realize what is happening, and they, along with the Lake Town soldiers and Bilbo, fall back to the city. The orcs lay siege to Dale, using what appear to be catapult-laden trolls. These are extremely mobile, of course being attached to the back of trolls, making me wonder why this is the only time they are ever used in the entirety of the Middle-Earth Saga. They also have suicide headbutt trolls that ree their way into the city walls to get to the Hornby train set Azog had promised them. The civilians are then attacked, including Gaston's children. Gaston has at this point arrived back in Dale so as to protect his children. He attempts to locate them whilst ordering his people, and he leads a charge against the orcs accompanied by Gandalf and Bilbo. Greasebag also orders a charge before hiding because, obviously. Gaston's son is able to save his sisters from 2 orcs, thankfully there were only 2 of them, by killing both. I like that he doesn't actually win a fight against them. The reason he wins is because he surprises the first, and the second is blind luck as the orc's weapon gets stuck. So this is certainly rather convenient, but as these characters serve no mechanical purpose in the plot, and the fact that Gaston's son attacked the orcs likely doubting that he would survive but did so anyway so as to save his sisters, I think this moment works well enough. He is not suddenly Superman because he is Gaston's son. They then manage to find Gaston, but they catch the attention of a nearby troll. So, in something a little more grounded than this movie, what might we expect to happen next? Gaston has to save his children. Well, Gaston is an extremely skilled bowman. Although he, for some reason, does not have his bow with him, there are many other soldiers who do. What might be reasonably expected is for his children to flee in his direction away from the troll, and for Gaston to attempt to bring it down from range. We could also go one step further and manufacture a way for Gaston to work with his son to bring down the troll together. Maybe Gaston fails to kill the troll with his bow, has no more arrows and finds himself cornered, only for his son to shoot the troll in the back, allowing Gaston the chance to cut its throat. But, oh boy, this is what they went with. So instead of the rather more sensible and potentially more narratively and thematically coherent idea that I just came up with in 5 seconds, Gaston grabs a cart and throws himself down the hill. The cart somehow stays intact and heading in the correct direction. He nearly runs over his children, and he takes out the troll by launching himself into it.
Mission accomplished.
Anyway, we then see Thranduil and Dane battling some more of the orcs outside of the city. We get yet another strange troll-type abomination. This one appears to have had its hands and feet removed and replaced with giant metal flails. It has also had its eyes removed, and it is steered by pulling on chains hooked into its eyelids. So this is the kind of thing that either looks really cool or really silly, depending on the viewer's age and their daily sugar intake. But my primary question is, why would you ever remove the troll's feet, as this only impedes its combat effectiveness? Come to think of it, why would you do any of this? This thing can't see. It can barely walk. It has no hands. In what universe is this thing more effective than a non-mutilated troll? Meanwhile, Gaston tells his son to gather the women and children and take them to the Great Hall. Pay close attention. Women and children. No, I am not highlighting this to make another joke about how cultural norms have drastically shifted in the last decade. I am highlighting this because it is about to become a plot point in this movie.
Take them to the Great Hall and barricade the door.
I want to stay with you.
Show your father some respect. You leave it to me, sire. You heard him. We make for the Great Hall. Alfred, women and children only. I need every man fighting. See that you return. I'll get them to safety, sire.
Gaston explicitly tells Greasebag that only women and children are to be barricaded in the Great Hall, and that he needs every man fighting. Greasebag is, of course, a man, and yet has no intentions of fighting. And given that Gaston knows exactly who Greasebag is, I have absolutely no idea why he even considers trusting him to save the lives of the Lake Townian women and children. As he leaves with the children, Greasebag verbally abuses an old woman and then throws the sword Gaston gave him to Gaston's son. Then, and I promise you I am not joking, he launches himself through the crowd of wounded soldiers, screaming, "Out of my way, abandon the cripples."
Out of my way! Abandon the cripples!
Moving on, we then get some cartoon bullshit with Thranduil's moose impaling 5 orcs at once before he beheads them, and then we get this. Okay, so his moose has just been cooked. He is likely incredibly pissed off right about now and would much rather be chilling with a glass of wine. This quick fight shows us how skilled Thranduil is, that he is not all bark and no bite, and that he is willing to personally risk his life in the fight against evil. What I am unsure about is why, if the filmmakers were going to include this scene of Thranduil being a badass, did they feel the need to preempt it with the absurdity of the moose-assisted multi-decapitation? Literally remove that, and this sequence functions almost perfectly. Moving on, Azog then says that they cannot hold the city and that the dwarves are almost spent, bringing us to the mid-battle low point, where it appears that evil has triumphed. Dane's piggy is also kebabbed, Dane presumably regretting only bringing 10 or so Twiddly Widdlies, at which point he says,
"Where's Thorin?"
Because, of course, 13 more soldiers will totally change the tide of battle. So, now we will take a break before returning to Erebor to find out what Thorin has been doing. Alright, Dane, extremely brave, reckless, and heroic. Kili, extremely brave and willing to fight. Thranduil is pragmatic and is an extremely skilled warrior. Azog is a cunning military strategist. Greasebag hates good, likes bad. Cut back to Erebor, where Dwalin is confronting Thorin on their inaction.
Since when do we forsake our own people? They are dying out there.
I think it is no accident that the filmmakers have decided to have Dwalin confront Thorin. Dwalin has so far been by far the most gung-ho in his support for Thorin, and the fact that even he now doubts Thorin's decision-making makes very clear how far he has fallen. One question that I assume will never be answered, but why did Thorin not want to help Dane against the orcs? Yes, I am well aware that Thorin is crazy, but dragon sickness has, for the most part, seemingly only affected his rationality with regard specifically to the treasure. If the orcs defeat Dane, Thranduil, and Gaston, Thorin will not have any treasure over which to be crazy. And to reinforce the fact that this really doesn't make any sense, we need look no further than Thror, Thorin's grandfather. After being afflicted by the sickness, Thror led the dwarves in the Battle of Moria, so this sickness doesn't seem to actually hamper the afflicted's aptitude when it comes to basic cognition. Anyway, Thorin's response is bonkers because, yeah, Thorin's fucking bonkers. Dwalin persists that their kin are being slaughtered, and Thorin continues to be fucking bonkers.
We must move the gold further underground to safety.
Dean is surrounded. They'll be slaughtered, Thorin.
Many die in war. Life is cheap, but a treasure such as this cannot be counted in lives lost. It is worth all the blood we can spend.
His only concern seems to be that the treasure is protected. Then we get a line from Dwalin that I really appreciate.
You sit here in these vast halls with a crown upon your head, and yet you are lesser now than you have ever been.
Nothing much to say about this other than that I really like that Dwalin is finally being explored. He does have a line, and Thorin has crossed it. He then continues that Thorin will always be his king, but that he is unaware of what he has become. And then...
Get out. Before I kill you.
This is relatively in line with Thorin's previous behavior, as we have already seen. Dragon sickness seems to make the affected simply behave in the opposite way to how they would usually act. We then see Thorin walking on the now solidified gold puddle that they attempted to drown Smaug in a couple of days prior. We hear the voices of Dwalin, Balin, Gandalf, Bilbo, and Gaston in Thorin's head, as he replays their respective comments on his madness.
A sickness lies upon that treasure.
Mind ambition of a mountain king.
It's ours. It's ours. And ours alone.
Treasure.
He then hallucinates himself being consumed by gold, and then he isn't crazy anymore. No, I'm not joking. This is what happens.
Sickness be gone!
We got better.
Just like that, in the space of what we have to assume is a few minutes, given the fact that there is a battle going on right at this very moment, Thorin has uncrazied himself by trying really hard. Excellent. Well, this certainly reminds me of the sequence in The Desolation of Smaug where everyone was tripping balls until they weren't. Except that the sheer amount of time dedicated to this crazy gold subplot makes this unforgivable. The crazy hallucination forest in The Desolation of Smaug was an isolated incident that should have been cut, and in the theatrical version of the film, it was cut, as it does not affect the rest of the film. The dragon sickness subplot is integral to the narrative of this trilogy, in particular the Battle of the Five Armies. The reason this happens is so as to allow Thorin to redeem himself and join the fight. But because the writers had written themselves into a corner, there was no alternative to, and then he wasn't crazy anymore. Yeah, that'll do. In the interest of plugging any potential accusation that I'm oversimplifying or being dishonest in my explanation of what actually happened to Thorin, I will elaborate slightly. The way this scene is presented is not unlike that of an intense drug withdrawal scene. Thorin hallucinates and seems tormented by the voices of his friends accusing him of being greedy and selfish. Had this taken place over a long period of time, then I could maybe buy the idea of him returning to something approximating his true self after suffering in isolation and realizing how sick he has become. The problem is that this seems to take place over a period of approximately 5 minutes, making the idea that he suddenly isn't crazy absolutely fucking laughable. One parallel I can draw is to the withdrawal sequence from Trainspotting. These two scenes are somewhat similar in terms of how they are depicted, but importantly, there is a very obvious passage of time in the Trainspotting sequence. You do not detox from heroin in 5 minutes, and it is impossible to come away from the scene with that interpretation. Imagine if Renton said to his friends, "Hey guys, I'll see you at the pub tonight," and then we had the withdrawal scene in his bedroom, and then he goes to the pub later that evening. That would absolutely cheapen the entire sequence, reducing it to a vapid and oversimplified parody of what actual heroin withdrawal might be like. That is pretty much what we have in the Battle of the Five Armies. For the entire duration of Thorin's hallucinations, the battle is raging outside their gates. Dane has already been surrounded. Dwalin imploring Thorin to help Dane is what prompts Thorin to confront his madness. And by the time he has finished giving himself an intervention and leads his dwarves outside of Erebor to save his cousin, Dane is still in the process of being surrounded. Therefore, I think that my claim that Thorin uncrazied himself in 5 minutes flat is an entirely reasonable read of the scene. Imagine for a moment that after befriending Frodo, Gollum had a chat with his subconscious, and then in the next scene he was totally not addicted to the One Ring anymore. The One Ring would have been built up as irresistible and absolute in its corruption, only for this to then be undone in a moment. I can't say that this is precisely what has happened here, because the rules and effects of Thorin's sickness are nowhere near as clear as the effects of the One Ring, but what I can say is that Thorin overcoming it this easily with zero outside help in the space of a few minutes is pathetic. Dane, meanwhile, orders his warriors to regroup at Erebor, having suffered heavy losses. As we see in this shot, they are outnumbered at least 10-1. Inside Erebor, we see Thorin approach his party, and they resolve to join the battle. In order to get out of Erebor, they swing a giant golden bell into their barricade. I assume the rest of them had been playing around in the forges again so as to whip up this giant bell, and Thorin heroically leads the remnants of Dane's army against the orcs. This adds yet another issue to the sudden reprieve from his madness. If Thorin had decided to stop being crazy 5 minutes later, Dane and the remaining dwarves would have been slaughtered. We can draw a parallel to Gandalf's timely arrival at Helm's Deep. In that instance, Gandalf certainly did arrive just in time. However, he had always planned to arrive at this particular time with Éomer and the exiled Rohirrim. This did not come out of nowhere, and Theoden only needed to hold until that morning. In the Battle of the Five Armies, Thorin has arrived just in time to save Dane and his army, entirely because he decided to stop being crazy just in time. I say again, pathetic. During the ensuing battle, a troll is brought down, and then his catapult goes off, making him do a flip and then land with a silly face. And Bombur also knocks over an orc with a belly slam. Bofur then manages to take control of the previously seen mutilated troll, and the fighting continues. Brace yourselves for what is about to come next. Okay, Dwalin will not follow a madman and loves his king. Thorin got better, and Kili doesn't like people fighting for him. Thorin and Dane embrace, and Thorin devises a plan to defeat the vastly more numerous orcs.
I hope you've got a plan.
Aye. We're going to take out their leader.
And so, Thorin leads a charge to Ravenhill to confront Azog, with Dwalin, Balin, Fili, and Kili following on a chariot. There were quite a few heroic charges in The Lord of the Rings with questionable odds of survival, but never any quite like this. Thorin approaches the orc army, who have all seemingly forgotten that they are wielding pikes, and he breaks their lines without so much as a scratch. Almost as if this orc army does not in fact exist in reality. It is merely a copied and pasted asset that poses no threat to the main characters. In this film, there are two types of orcs. The ones that are a fully CG horde that only pose a threat to the CG hordes of elves and dwarves, and the ones that are individual orcs that are allowed to physically interact with the main characters. Anyway, the chariot follows and causes much destruction in its wake. We now come to the video game level sequence for the Battle of the Five Armies. We of course get the usual ridiculous physics and scripted non-threatening bad guy encounters for the heroes to carve their way through for maximum XP, but curiously, this scene is very different from any other in the entire 6-film saga. You may not be aware, but every other Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movie was rated 12+ or PG-13 in the US. The sole exception is the extended cut of the Battle of the Five Armies, which curiously received a 15+ rating in the UK or an R rating in the US. What could possibly warrant an R rating in a movie about fantasy wizards intended for children? Well, I'm going to show you. Let's just say things get gunky. For clarity, I will break down what happens, and I will save any thoughts on the heightened level of violence for the end of this sequence. First up, the blades on the chariot wheels slice off the legs of many of the orcs. And now, dear viewer, it seems we have reached the second round of multiple choice. As the dwarves are carving their way through the orc army, what do you think happens next? Is it A, the dwarves encounter another one of their chariots, which has been commandeered by orcs, and they fight whilst chasing each other? Is it option B, Kili falls off the chariot and runs at ludicrous speed so as to catch up and jump back on? Is it option C, the orcs attempt to stop the chariots using catapults and obviously miss every shot? Or is it option D, multiple trolls line up neatly, allowing the chariot to go over a jump and decapitate them all in one go? Yeah, so here's what happens. These 6 trolls all line up perfectly for seemingly no reason, resulting in a sextuple decapitation. If they had done this deliberately, I would still have a very hard time believing that this amount of coordination is possible. Where's Thorin? They then dodge a particularly large troll, resulting in them careening into a frozen river. Bofur arrives atop his mutilated troll abomination, and he is able to bring down the other troll. Then they encounter this. I have no idea what this troll was doing. I guess it jumped in the river to hold the bridge so that the orcs could cross, meaning that the orc army is now down 1 troll because the orcs didn't want to get their feet wet? Maybe I'm thinking too hard about this. The reason this is here is to be a bullet sponge for the dwarves and to die in a funny way. Then they get attacked by 2 wargs that manage to kill a couple of the goats. Where's Thorin? I thought you were going with him. And then a warg is crushed against a rock and blended into mincemeat. So, having now lost 3 of their 6 goats, Dwalin realizes that they are carrying too much weight and will be caught by the orcs. Balin then tells Dwalin that he, Fili, and Kili should ride the remaining 3 goats to help Thorin defeat Azog, and that Balin's goat riding days are over. The understanding between these two seems to be that Balin will have a heroic last stand and will go down holding the wargs back. An orc is then decapitated by the spinning blades. As Dwalin, Fili, and Kili detach their goats, the chariot does a perfect 180-degree spin, bringing us to the turret section of the video game level, thus allowing Balin to mow down the wargs, meaning that all 4 of them are only alive because of blind luck. Although, honestly, the breaking point for suspension of disbelief was about 7 hours ago in this trilogy, so I can't really be too hard on this. Anyway, they then see Thorin, who has somehow managed to ride his way through the entire orc army off-screen. Because, yeah, why not? Why should I expect anything more from this film? As Rings of Power taught us, if it is off-screen, it does not exist. So because we didn't see what actually happened to Thorin in the last few minutes, it actually makes complete sense that he's here now. I think a few of my brain cells just committed seppuku. Anyway, so regarding the violence in this scene, I am not one to shy away from extreme levels of violence in films, provided it is justified by the context. I am not into gore for the sake of gore, but that said, a good amount of blood and guts can be absolutely crucial in making a given scene function. The presence of blood helps communicate to the audience who has taken damage and how much damage is fatal. This is partly why I struggle sometimes with PG-13 rated action movies because of the lack of blood. For an example of this, take a look at this fight scene from Fast and Furious 7. In this scene, the characters are landing multiple hits and supposedly injuring each other, and yet there is almost no progression of injuries or combat effectiveness. They are simply hitting each other until the other one stops moving. Now take a look at this scene from the Raid 2. In this scene, both characters are dealing a huge amount of damage to each other. This is abundantly clear because visually we can see it as the fight progresses. This means that the stakes of the fight, as well as its progression in terms of who has the upper hand, is abundantly clear. One other problem with a lack of blood can be that it is harder to tell when or why a character has actually died, as one way of showing this may be to show a large amount of blood, but if the ratings board will not allow this, then it can result in a lack of visual clarity. So there is absolutely a place and a purpose for heightened amounts of violence in films, and I am by no means a prude who fundamentally objects to the idea of violence or gore. So, how does all this apply to The Hobbit? Well, until this scene, the movies have been almost entirely bloodless. The visual language of the film is telling the audience that when someone dies, there is not an abundance of blood. Think back to the multiple decapitations of orcs that we have had so far. And not one of them had anywhere near this amount of blood splatter. So the problem here is consistency, or rather a lack of. It is extremely jarring to suddenly have fountains of blood come from nowhere, regardless of whether or not it is more realistic, because the films have conditioned the audience for 7 hours into thinking that this is not how the world worked. We can assume that the company of Thorin had to stop a few times to empty their bowels on the way to Erebor, but because the films didn't suddenly show us in detail how Gloin likes to do a poo, this is never brought to our attention, and so it is instantly accepted as something that happens off-screen. And in this case, realism isn't even the goal, seemingly, as the camera lingers explicitly on the mutilated corpses after every glory kill. The point of this sequence, and only this sequence, is look at all the gory ways they kill things. This chase scene is essentially a scripted series of creative kills, much like the escape from Goblin Town and the barrel chase. Only the difference here is the sudden and excessive presence of bodily fluids. As I've said, I have no problem whatsoever with the fundamental idea of comedy gore or extreme slapstick violence. Look no further than the opening scene of Deadpool for an example of a movie that does this pretty well. The problem is that this style of comedy and this depiction of action violence does not belong in Middle-Earth for reasons that I have explained. On another point, throughout making these videos, I have received the odd comment saying something along the lines of, "It's just a children's story, of course it's silly, stop criticizing it." This is not a children's story. Or, to be more specific, there are parts of these films that could be considered a children's story, but many parts, in particular this entire sequence, are not exactly something anyone should expect to find in Harry Potter, Narnia, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So, in conclusion, this sequence plays out like a theme park attraction. There are 6 different surprises along the way, all spaced out one by one for maximum entertainment for the kiddies, and it all comes off as exceedingly tone-deaf, and it is easily the most jarring sequence in these films. Okay, Balin is too old for this shit, and Thorin is invincible. Meanwhile, knowing that their men are being slaughtered and are losing, the women in the town hall decide to take up arms and join the fight. And then this happens.
Come with us, love.
No. You leave an old woman.
Don't be afraid.
Get him!
What the fuck are you doing here?
So, Greasebag has disguised himself as a woman and done an absurd high-pitched parody of a woman's voice before snapping at this other woman in his regular voice. Her intention is clearly to pretend to be an old woman so as to not have to do any fighting, because of course this character is a coward with a capital C. She is also, however, unfathomably, incredibly, and cartoonishly unintelligent. If Greasebag genuinely wanted to go unnoticed and not do any fighting, one would expect that she would try that little bit harder to conceal herself.
Dumb bitch.
So, having now been revealed, she is declared a weasel by the other women, and then... Because, in case you had forgotten, dear viewer, Greasebag is defined by 2 characteristics. Coward and money. Although, I guess she has recently added stunning and brave to her repertoire. And as we will soon see, she is about to expand those 4 characteristics to a total of 6. And so the elderly, the women, and the injured all charge the orcs. Greasebag is later seen attempting to leave Dale after having acquired 2 entirely new personality traits in the form of
Boom.
She is pursued by a troll, but is saved by Gaston. So, Greasebag believes that Gaston is an idiot for not becoming the new master, even though he is, in effect, the leader of the Lake Townians, meaning that this makes no sense. She also insults Gaston seconds after he saved her life.
Get up.
Get away from me.
I don't take orders from you. Master's mantle was there for the taking, and he threw it all away. For what?
And this suggests quite blatantly that Gaston threw away the mantle of Master of Laketown because he loves his kids.
What?
This is also something that didn't happen in this film, so I'm unsure why the writers think that it did. And then, after all of the ridiculous bullshit that Greasebag has done, Gaston still lets her go with 2 boobs filled with gold. After a brief cutaway, we see Gandalf as he approaches a troll that is slapping about the Lake Townians, and he attempts to cast a spell. I didn't mention this earlier, but we did see Radagast give his staff to Gandalf, which is the staff he is now using, and is also the staff we see Gandalf with in Fellowship of the Ring. The staff doesn't appear to be working as intended, almost leading to Gandalf getting himself killed. This is pretty remarkable. Imagine being given an awesome new gun by someone, then walking up to a troll without checking to see if there are any bullets in it. Gandalf evidently did not confirm his ability to use this staff properly in any of the downtime prior to the battle. He tries multiple times to cast a spell, and still, nothing happens. And I hope, dear viewer, that you are ready for what this alternative way of thinking facilitates. What I am about to cover is perhaps the single greatest moment in movie history. It is worth plowing your way through all 3 extended versions just for the sheer glory of what you are about to witness. If you have seen the extended, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but if you have only ever seen the theatrical cut, you are about to be shaking with disbelief. Once again, I will give you guys multiple choices, see if you can guess what happens next. Is it option A, Greasebag shows Gandalf how to use the staff properly, thus allowing Gandalf to kill the troll? Is it option B, Greasebag accidentally falls off the roof to her death due to her newly developed money boobs, distracting the troll, saving Gandalf? Is it option C, Greasebag accidentally catapults herself into the troll's mouth, saving Gandalf? Or is it option D, Gandalf brings the troll down, and then Greasebag tries to rob the troll in case it has any gold, and she is then killed by the nearly dead troll? Okay, votes are in. I will now take you through it step by step without making any comments until the end. I am simply going to tell you what happens. So, Greasebag is hiding in this catapult. Upon seeing the oncoming troll, she screams and attempts to leave her hiding place. A coin from her money boob falls and lands on the trigger mechanism for the catapult. The troll raises its weapon over Gandalf, who is still unable to defend himself. The mechanism fires and Greasebag is launched into the troll's mouth. The troll then chokes, collapses, and a shower of gold coins falls from Greasebag's corpse. Moments like this are why I thoroughly enjoy what I do. This is an actual scene from the film. Yes, I am very aware that this is extended only, but this is still as much a part of the Battle of the Five Armies as the Boromir flashback is a part of the Two Towers. This is not a parody. This is not fan fiction. This is something that was scripted and put to film as part of a near billion-dollar movie trilogy. Where do I even fucking begin? Gandalf being unable to cast whatever spell he was trying to cast requires that he is an idiot, as this is evidently the first time he has attempted to use his staff since Radagast gave it to him.
A word of warning, it can be a bit dicky sometimes. You just have to twiddle with the top.
This is dumb for reasons I have already mentioned. Gandalf surviving as long as he does against the troll relies on silly levels of plot armor, particularly given the hordes of people trolls have been seen to mow through without issue. Greasebag has hidden inside a catapult, which is kind of like hiding inside the barrel of an artillery cannon. Or in other words, this is some Looney Tunes level of slapstick that can only be a consequence of unfathomable levels of neurodivergence. The extremely poor luck on Greasebag's part that a coin just so happened to land in precisely the wrong location. The trigger mechanism being so delicate as to fire when a coin is dropped on it is ridiculous, as it means that this entire siege weapon would be impossible to use when mounted on the back of a troll if the whole thing goes off with the slightest nudge. The implication from this scene is that Gandalf is about to be killed and would have been if not for Greasebag's mishap. Meaning that, once again, Gandalf's survival and therefore the eventual defeat of Sauron are contingent upon this abominable clown's behavior. The catapult firing Greasebag directly into the troll's mouth also requires extreme amounts of luck. This kind of trick shot does not just happen. And Gandalf's survival relies entirely on this happening by accident, at precisely the right moment. And finally, the cherry on top of the afterbirth that is this scene is the final shot where we see the coins fall out of the troll's mouth, confirming the level of intelligence that the writers expect of their audience. This seems to have been inserted so that the lowest common denominator can proudly declare, "Oh, he got what he deserved, didn't he?" And here's the thing, it does not take any talent whatsoever to depict a character whose death would be cathartic to watch. This is frequently done in films to varying effect. One obvious example of this is in the first John Wick. The bad guy kills John's puppy, and so we very much want to see John murderfuck the absolute tits off the guy because killing puppies is not very nice. In the case of John Wick, it is very efficient. Man is bad because man kills puppy. No time is wasted showing us 10 different scenes of man killing 10 different puppies. In the case of Greasebag, they have spent an unforgivable amount of time hammering home the utter one-dimensionality of this character. He is hideous to look at. He doesn't care if he causes people to starve. He is an idiot. He is disheveled and filthy. He doesn't like elections. He is corrupt. He is extremely greedy. He doesn't care about anyone other than himself. He is physically abusive towards women. He has no honor and no moral compass. Is extremely incompetent, hates disabled people, and is tremendously cowardly. In other words, this character has zero redeeming qualities, and the films have taken a copious amount of time to make sure everyone knows how detestable this character is. All so that he can be killed in what I assume is supposed to be an extremely over-the-top and cathartic death scene where he finally gets what's coming to him. Greasebag could have been redeemed. Maybe he goes down swinging, even if rather pathetically, to save the women and children. Maybe he feels genuinely inspired by Gaston. Maybe there could be more to this character beyond clown who is bad and then dies. Anyway, it is time to move on from this glorious scene as we still have an hour of this film to go. It never ends. Okay, Greasebag is stunning and brave and rude and makes things up. And Gandalf is an idiot. Gandalf and Bilbo then observe Thorin, Dwalin, Fili, and Kili on their way to Ravenhill, and it is at this point that Legolas and Ladylas arrive with some pretty bad news.
There is a second army. Bolg leads a force of Gundabad orcs. They are almost upon us.
And they realize that if Bolg's army from Gundabad is arriving from the north, then they will hit Ravenhill first. And Ladylas realizes that her little cocktail sausage might be about to die. We later see Thranduil taking pause momentarily upon realizing how many of his soldiers have fallen, and he consequently orders his army to fall back. This then prompts Bilbo to decide that he will warn Thorin of the impending reinforcements. Gandalf, of course, does not want Bilbo to die for no reason, believing that the orcs will see him coming. As Bilbo is currently in possession of a magic ring that can turn him invisible, he is confident that he will be able to reach Thorin.
I'll go.
You'll never make it.
Why not?
Because they will see you coming and kill you.
No, they won't.
I won't allow it.
I'm not asking you to allow it, Gandalf.
So here, I really quite like that Bilbo has decided to return and help his friend, even after everything they have been through. The last time Thorin saw Bilbo, he tried to murder him by throwing him off the ramparts. And yet, Bilbo is evidently more than willing to, for the fourth time in this trilogy, risk his life to rescue Thorin. And so, Bilbo puts the ring on and makes his way through the battle. Meanwhile, Ladylas blocks Thranduil's retreat, refusing to allow him to turn away. For you see, Ladylas needs help to go and rescue her little munchkin.
Dwarves will be slaughtered.
Yes, they will die. Today, tomorrow, 1 year hence, 100 years from now. What does it matter? They are mortal.
Ladylas then declares that there is no love in Thranduil's life, which is an interesting thing to say to a guy who, as she learned very recently, lost his wife. Yes, this may literally mean that there is no love in Thranduil's life, but given the context, this absolutely comes off as though Ladylas is mocking him. Consequently, Thranduil disarms her because she was standing a sword length away from him whilst wielding a bow.
You're so stupid!
And he tells her that she knows nothing of love. He then asks if she is ready to die for her love.
What you feel for that dwarf is not real. You think it is love. Are you ready to die for it?
This gives us the smallest peek behind the curtain that is Thranduil. He clearly loved his wife very much, and the implication is that he risked his life trying to save her, but was unsuccessful. This sits very neatly into many of his other behaviors, namely his wine consumption, his apathy towards the world in general, and his disdain for mortals. He seems to truly believe that elven lives are worth more because they are immortal, which also informs his decision to retreat. Anyway, before Ladylas can answer, Legolas spawns off camera and tells Ladylas he will go with her to rescue her boy toy. This tells us that Legolas is willing to help Ladylas do something that actively goes against his own desires. He knows that she loves Kili over him, but because he respects her, he has decided to help nonetheless. Rather critically, Legolas does not seem to actually have any affinity towards the dwarves at this point. He is not helping her because he was impressed by seeing Kili fighting or something. This is one instance of the filmmakers being careful in actively avoiding contradicting the Lord of the Rings, as when we first meet Legolas in Fellowship, he is not particularly respectful of dwarves. We then get a rather quick sequence of fighting, which is worth mentioning. Bofur is killed when an orc demolishes his face with a spiked axe. Except that, actually, no, Bofur is totally fine. Somehow. Then Bifur launches himself at the orc, and instead of killing it like a normal person, because as we have seen, Bifur is anything but normal, he headbutts it, thus embedding the other end of the axe lodged in his own skull into the orc.
What is happening?
This film is strange. Bofur then realizes that Bifur has lost his axe, as it evidently came out with the orc.
Bye, Durin. You've lost your axe.
No, he's not. There you go, cousin.
Holy shit, you can talk.
This is the one single example of Bombur speaking. Why he chooses to speak at this moment and no other, I can't even begin to fathom.
You know where you can stick that.
Alright, this one actually made me laugh. I have laughed many times whilst watching this film, but this is the one time when I laughed at a joke that the film actively made. Additionally, this tells us that the reason Bifur behaved like a special little boy with brain damage was because, as I had suspected, he had an axe in his face. It might not be entirely realistic to say that once the axe is gone, he's all back to normal, but this is the kind of realism that I honestly don't care about. All it facilitates is a joke, so nothing else breaks in order to make me laugh. Okay, Thranduil values Elven lives over all others, and possibly risked his life for love. Bombur can actually speak. Legolas respects Ladylas, and Ladylas is totally in love. After cutting their way through some more orcs, the dwarves observe that Ravenhill appears empty. Thorin orders Fili and Kili to scout ahead, while he and Dwalin deal with the 100 or so goblins that have just arrived.
No more than 100. We'll take care of them. Go!
Because these characters are of course invincible until they aren't. After a brief cutaway, we return to Fili.
Search the lower levels. I've got this.
And this seems remarkably dumb, but okay. You are pretty certain Azog is here. This is the entire reason why you are at Ravenhill to begin with. And even if Azog is alone, he will absolutely fuck you up. I assume this is why Thorin sent Fili and Kili together, but I guess this is the perfect time for, hey gang, let's split up. Meanwhile, Thorin and Dwalin have evidently defeated the 100 goblins that spawned in so as to force Fili and Kili to be separated from them. And suddenly, Bilbo.
Thorin!
Bilbo.
You have to leave here, now.
Curiously, Thorin is right back to how he was prior to the end of the desolation of Smaug, where he flipped on a dime and became crazy. He shows no hostility to Bilbo whatsoever. Remember, the circumstances surrounding Bilbo and Thorin's current relationship has not changed. Bilbo still took the King's Jewel, Thorin's birthright, from Erebor and gave it to Thranduil. Thranduil and Gaston still intend to take a portion of Thorin's treasure. The last time Thorin saw Bilbo, he attempted to murder him for his betrayal. The only thing that has changed is that Thorin has decided not to be crazy anymore. Anyway, Dwalin wants to find Azog and finish the job, but Thorin heeds Bilbo's warning.
Azog has another army attacking from the north.
We are so close. That orc scum is in there. I say we push on. No.
That's what he wants. This is a trap.
Azog means to kill us all.
Take your brother. Scout out the towers.
One by one, he will destroy the line of Durin.
Are you retarded?
If only there was something you could have done differently so as to avoid this. I know that Thorin, of course, didn't know about the incoming army, but even with the knowledge that there were, at the very least, 100 goblins plus Azog hiding somewhere in Ravenhill, I would have thought it more practical and reasonable not to send Fili and Kili off on their own. I hope nothing bad happens to them as a direct result of this decision. So he orders Dwalin to go and find Fili and Kili, meaning that all 4 of the dwarves are now split up as a result of one silly decision to send half your men scouting. Before Dwalin can move very far, Azog appears alongside a captured Fili. He says in black speech, "This one dies first, then the brother, then you, Oakenshield. You will die last." This is pretty in character for Azog, although as no one else speaks the black speech, this threat will not have been directly understood. And then, Fili is filleted.
That bitch is dead.
Unfortunately, he was not wearing any mithril. I guess Thorin had some to give Bilbo, but not his own nephew. Fili's corpse then falls and lands in front of his brother, who flies into a fit of rage and pursues Azog, which seems like absolutely something Kili would do. He is not overcome by grief, he is fully in revenge mode. Thorin rushes to save his one remaining nephew. Dwalin follows, and Bilbo stays put, drawing his sword, unsure of what to do. Whilst en route to Kili, Thorin is ambushed by Azog, which reinforces that Azog personally wants to be the one to defeat Thorin. We know that he has other orcs with him, and therefore could easily surround him, so his goal is not simply that Thorin dies. He personally wants to rip him apart. Additionally, this suggests that his previous threat, stating that Thorin will die last, may in fact have been his way of provoking Thorin into attacking. Plus, of course, the fact that he just murdered Fili, although the fact that Thorin does not speak the black speech makes this idea a little flimsy. Okay, Azog is sadistic, and Thorin is not particularly good at keeping people alive. And then the hordes of Gundabad arrive. Bilbo is swarmed by orcs, and he does not seem to react, possibly due to the shock of seeing Fili die, but he is saved by Dwalin. So the fact that these orcs have arrived, along with Bolg and a load of bats, would suggest that the entirety of the Gundabad army is right here, right now. Luckily, we have 5 or so main characters to fight them off. I like those odds. So then a Gundabat flies down to Legolas and lets him grab it instead of attacking him. And it sure is lucky there was one bat and only one bat, otherwise he would not be able to do this. So the reason why this happens is to separate Legolas and Ladylas and thus allow them to fulfill their narrative functions. Legolas needs to have his boss fight with Bolg that was set up in the previous film, and Ladylas needs to try to rescue her manstress. Meanwhile, during the ensuing fighting, Thorin actually gets the upper hand on Azog, but is interrupted by the arrival of some more orcs. Dwalin and Bilbo continue to fight off the horde, Bilbo by throwing rocks, as he doesn't want to get anywhere near the carnage if he can help it. Why he is still visible, however, I am not sure. While Ladylas fights her way to her little pickle, Legolas is about to do something both hilarious and absurd. No, we're not at the bridge scene yet, that will have to wait. Once again, I am going to give you multiple choices, as this moment is only in the extended version, so no doubt many of you are entirely unprepared for this insanity. Is it option A, Legolas encounters Bolg, also hanging from a Gundabat, and they do battle mid-air? Option B, Legolas dangles upside down from the Gundabat and decapitates 100 or so orcs. Option C, Legolas flips the Gundabat under his feet and surfs it through the air while popping off shots with his bow. Or option D, Legolas removes the Gundabat's wings and attaches them to his own arms, forming a makeshift windsuit. Alrighty, votes are in, time to reveal what actually happened. I really don't think I need to spend any time on this. I just find it hilarious that this is able to happen. As this quick moment is not integral to anyone's survival or any plot mechanics, it is simply a couple of shots of something utterly ridiculous occurring, so I will move on. After defeating multiple orcs, Bilbo is whacked in the face by Bolg, rendering him unconscious. I am unsure why Bolg went for the less than lethal method of dealing with an enemy, as this is certainly not something he has ever been shown to do before. And it is doubly lucky that this happens after Bilbo and Dwalin had dealt with all of the orcs, otherwise Bilbo would likely be killed whilst unconscious. Meanwhile, Azog has evidently had enough of fighting Thorin and orders his orcs to finish him off. This confuses the interpretation that Azog personally wants to rip Thorin's head off, which has been suggested not once but twice at this point, and it also allows for Legolas to consume some of his ammunition. This may seem like a strange thing to highlight, but trust me, there is a reason why I'm bringing this to your attention. Meanwhile, during her search for Kili, Ladylas is ambushed by Bolg, who manages to overpower her, but, once again, does not deal a killing blow when he easily could have. This is a problem because of what is about to happen. So, Kili sees Bolg standing there not killing Ladylas, and he attacks in order to save her. Bolg then almost immediately gets Kili with Kili. It really does appear then that Thorin cared more about Bilbo's life than he did about either of his nephews. This actually deserves a little more exploration. I can totally buy none of the dwarves having Mithril at the start of an unexpected journey, as they seem to be a disparate faction with seemingly little in the way of resources, and they of course did not have access to Erebor or Moria at this point in time. By the start of the Battle of the Five Armies, they have retaken Erebor, the greatest kingdom in Middle-Earth. Erebor was, of course, incredibly wealthy and had not been raided since its fall due to the presence of a certain dragon, meaning that we can reasonably assume that such a great and wealthy dwarven city would have had mithril shirts in its armory. Therefore, given that I would like to assume that the dwarves do not want to die, I know, look at me being all charitable, they should all be wearing mithril shirts. And that is without even considering the scene in which Thorin gives Bilbo a mithril shirt, which confirms explicitly that they have access to them. I do not accept for a moment that the greatest kingdom in Middle-Earth only had one single mithril shirt, and even if it did, Thorin's decision to give this shirt to the one member of the company that is least likely to see combat is extremely confusing. The only way out of this is if we accept that there is only one single mithril shirt in Erebor, and that Thorin's counterproductive distribution of this mithril shirt is as a result of him being fucking bonkers, which is an incredible cop-out to suggest that he was crazy in exactly the right way so as to allow the plot to happen. I don't believe that the writers considered this when making the film. However, if this is what was intended, then this is worse than the conveniently crazy ex-King of Numenor in Rings of Power. So, why did the writers decide not to give mithril shirts to each of the dwarves? I honestly cannot even begin to guess. The reason cannot be that Fili and Kili needed to die, because wearing mithril does not make you invincible. You can still be decapitated or have your throat cut or be killed in any number of other ways. Because every main character death in this film is explicitly shown to be as a result of a stab to the torso, this can only mean that they were not wearing mithril shirts, which is fundamentally inexplicable.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Anyway, back to the film. So what has just happened is Bolg attacked Ladylas, but opted not to finish her off, and was then attacked by Kili, whom he immediately impaled. The reason why this happens is to allow for the tragic conclusion to this love story. Had Ladylas been killed, and then Kili also been killed after attacking Bolg in a fit of rage, this would also have been tragic. And as Ladylas is an entirely original creation of these movies, there is no in-law reason why they could not have done this. Alternatively, Ladylas and Kili could have fought together to bring down Bolg, allowing the potential for further development of their infatuation. We could have maybe seen them combine fighting styles, as well as showing them each putting themselves in danger to save the other. Maybe the scene could be upbeat and heroic, where they try to avenge Fili whilst attempting to bring down the nearly unstoppable Bolg, only for the tone to shift dramatically when one of them takes a fatal blow. Maybe they fail, and both are killed by Bolg, dying in each other's arms. This would then firmly establish how powerful Bolg is, and it would make the subsequent boss fight with Legolas emotionally charged, as Legolas, of course, cares deeply for Ladylas, rather than what we got, which was simply two people hitting each other until the other one stops moving. Keeping Ladylas alive only facilitates a minor payoff for Thranduil's character, and I do not consider this a worthy trade-off. Anyway, having now seen that guy she met a couple of days ago die in front of her, she grabs Bolg and throws them both off the cliff. It is possible that this was intended as suicide, however, they both survive the fall. Legolas sees this, and then... Okay, time to talk about arrows. The fact that Legolas, throughout The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, never runs out of arrows is not particularly realistic. I view this in the same way as I view the blood spatter issue I raised earlier, or the question of Gloin making a mighty poo. We can reasonably assume that ammunition is finite in Middle-Earth, in much the same way as we can reasonably assume that blood and poo exist, even though we rarely see any. This requires suspension of disbelief. However, as it is never brought to the attention of the audience, it is easy to suspend one's disbelief, and it is reasonable for the writers to expect this. This is much the same as how in many action movies, the number of bullets a particular gun can fire without reloading is often exaggerated. This is a concession that is sometimes a necessity depending on things like genre and tone. We can reasonably assume that whenever Legolas was off-screen, he was picking up more arrows, and we can also assume that due to how experienced and skillful he is at archery, he pays very close attention to the number of arrows remaining in his quiver. But the fact that we never see him doing any of this means that the number of arrows he has in his quiver is never brought to the attention of the audience. Until now. Right at the wrong time, Legolas has finally run out of arrows. How cataclysmically inconvenient. And, arguably, the only reason this happened was because Azog decided to send cannon fodder towards Thorin instead of fighting him himself, thus giving Legolas the opportunity to use all of his available arrows. So, Legolas needs to get to Bolg before Bolg can kill Ladylas. Naturally, he leaps off the tower and impales this stumpy troll boy in the head and makes it knock over the tower so as to make a bridge and also not squash Ladylas. At this point, I'm done commenting on run-of-the-mill stupidity in this film. I really need to focus on the important bits. And so, Legolas and Bolg do battle on the ruined tower as it falls apart. Meanwhile, we see Thorin above fighting more orcs. He throws one off the cliff, which causes Bolg to be squashed by rubble. You could describe this as convenient, and I mean, it is, but as this does not actually kill Bolg, it is merely a random, unlikely occurrence that is not elevated to the status of being plot armor. Thorin is then approached by another orc, and he is now unarmed, having left his sword in the previous orc's head. This scene is starting to look rather familiar, isn't it? So, Legolas throws his sword and saves Thorin, repaying the life debt that he didn't know he had. Okay, all joking aside, I actually like this. This is a moment of deliberate repetition that allows these two former enemies to help each other. I do also find it amusing that the sword Legolas was wielding, that he then threw to save Thorin, was Orcrist, the sword Thorin found in the Troll Horde that was subsequently confiscated by Legolas. This means that Legolas also considered it to be a particularly good blade, but he ultimately decided to part with it so as to save Thorin. And this then allows for Thorin to be reunited with his blade for his final scene, which, again, despite everything else going on, functions for me on a thematic level. Everything surrounding it is trash, but moments like this I do appreciate. Okay, Thorin does not care about his nephew's lives. Bilbo is horrendously lucky. Legolas is honorable and is a god. This next part of the film is the two climactic boss fights. Rather than depict each fight sequentially, the filmmakers decided to cut between the two. It is not at all uncommon to edit together separate fights or battles, indeed this happens frequently in The Lord of the Rings, but the problem that I have in this instance is that Thorin and Azog's emotionally charged climactic showdown is interrupted with, well, this. Yeah! I don't quite know what to say about this. Maybe I've become numbed by the sheer amount of bullshit present in these films so far. Does this look dumb? Absolutely. Is this moment extremely lucky? Absolutely. Is this the dumbest moment in the film? Not by a long shot. Is it physically possible for Legolas to do this? Fuck no. I honestly think this is self-evident, but I will explain briefly using my limited knowledge of physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. When you walk, your foot exerts a force on the ground, and the ground exerts an equal force back into your foot, thus allowing you to walk, or in this case, jump. In this scene, Legolas is exerting a force into the falling rubble, and because of the fact that the rubble is in free fall, it cannot exert the same force back into his foot. It is not possible to climb falling rubble unless your mass is 0. I did manage to find someone far better at mathematics than I am who managed to calculate how much Legolas weighs using this scene from Fellowship as a reference. By using the approximate tensile strength of snow and the size of his feet, they concluded that Legolas weighs approximately 7.5 pounds, or 3.5 kilos, which is approximately the weight of a newborn baby. Even if we ask no further questions and accept point blank that Legolas weighs less than 3.5 kilos, this is still fundamentally impossible without some other form of magic helping him. And going purely by the films, we have no reason to assume that there is. Anyway, Legolas then goes to stab Bolg, and Bolg grabs the blade using the same move that he used in the Desolation of Smaug to disarm Legolas. Notably, this exact setup and payoff also occurs in Spartacus, although in the case of Spartacus, it is subverted in an absolutely masterful way. Seriously, go and watch that show. Anyway, this time Legolas sees the trick coming, and so he is able to flip onto Bolg's shoulders and stab him in the head. Whilst I like the repetition of Bolg's sword grab move, this fight scene was pretty unbearable. And the fact that the filmmakers decided to cut to this scene not 15 seconds into the Thorin and Azog fight just indicates to me that they didn't have any faith in their audience's ability to concentrate on one thing at a time. Before we jump back into Thorin versus Azog, we see briefly that Legolas is looking for Ladylas now that he has defeated Bolg. This is the only explanation we get as to why neither of them assist in defeating Azog, as they are, or at least were, relatively close by. I think I'm willing to accept that Legolas would rather save Ladylas than Thorin, so whilst this is mildly convenient, I don't consider this to be particularly substantive. We now come to the long-awaited showdown between Thorin and Azog. Their choice of location is a frozen lake, and whilst this looks rather cinematic, it is also rather impractical for both parties, as walking, let alone fighting on ice, is something of a challenge. We see briefly the rest of the Gundabad army approaching the main battle that is presumably still going on, before Azog charges. Azog is fighting using a flail, and as a result is gradually breaking the ice upon which they are fighting. Thorin manages to land a hit on Azog, who then gets his flail stuck in the ice. And then... I am rather conflicted on how I feel with regard to this. On the one hand, this is the 4th time that the Eagles have arrived to save the day. But on the other hand, as this story chronologically takes place before The Lord of the Rings, this is in actuality the 2nd time. We also see that Radagast is riding one of them, and we already know both that Gandalf, or potentially wizards in general, have an affinity with the Eagles, plus the fact that Radagast appears to have a close relationship with animals in general. In the book, maybe this worked far better. As presented in the film, however, the army from Gundabad arrived literally 2 minutes ago in terms of screen time, and then the Eagles turn up and destroy them before they can actually do anything. The army from Gundabad does not have an impact upon the Battle of the Five Armies. Indeed, they do not actually arrive at the Battle of the Five Armies. The only thing the Gundabad army facilitated in the narrative is that it gave Bilbo a reason to travel to Ravenhill to warn Thorin. And the reason why this was deemed necessary, I suspect, is so that Bilbo could be present for the climax of the trilogy called The Hobbit. As Bilbo serves no further purpose, this could have been removed entirely. Yes, I am well aware that the army from Gundabad is present in the book, but at the risk of repeating myself, I am not analyzing the book. I am analyzing the film. If you take something mentioned quite literally once in the novel, expand upon it by dedicating a lot of time to explaining what Gundabad is, having Legolas and Ladylas go and investigate it, and having Bilbo risk his life to warn Thorin of the impending reinforcements from Gundabad, only to then have said reinforcements be deleted before they can actually do anything, then forgive me for accusing the film of wasting my motherfucking time.
Don't waste my motherfucking time!
Anyway, in addition to Radagast, Begone is also here riding one of the Eagles, before he promptly throws himself off whilst hundreds of feet up in the air. Anyway, whilst Azog is distracted by the Eagles, Thorin picks up Azog's flail and throws it to him.
What?
This thing was stuck in the ice. Unless you're telling me that Thorin is suddenly physically stronger than Azog, this does not make a lick of sense. He then steps backwards and allows Azog to fall into the frozen water. Thorin appears to defeat Azog by outsmarting him. He uses the environment to his advantage, and Azog pays the price for not concentrating. However, as this moment required that Thorin suddenly be stronger than Azog, this ends up as a bit of a mixed bag. We then see Azog floating downstream underneath the ice, which once again does not make any sense, as this is a frozen lake, with nowhere for the water to be flowing to. Azog appears dead, and Thorin follows, presumably to confirm that Azog has actually drowned. Then this happens. Azog launches himself up through the ice and catches Thorin off guard. This requires that the ice is thin enough for him to jump through, and that the lake was shallow enough for him to push himself up, both of which are certainly possible, although the idea that Azog can leap 8 feet or so directly up whilst fully submerged is a bit of a stretch. Azog, now having the upper hand, pins Thorin to the ground. After a struggle, here is what happens. Thorin realizes that he cannot beat Azog, and that his only chance at avenging his family is to allow himself to be killed. It is also entirely possible that he does not think himself worthy of ruling the dwarves after the whole crazy gold thing, and that this is his idea of penance. He is evidently also not wearing any mithril, but I have already said my piece on that. He then catches Azog off guard and skewers him through what appears to be a gap in his armor. So as far as epic fight scene climaxes go, I like this one a lot. The only major problem I have with it is the lack of explanation for why Thorin is not wearing mithril, or seemingly any armor of any kind. From a character perspective, Thorin defeats Azog by outsmarting him twice, rather than by physically overpowering or outmaneuvering him. He also pays the price for his misdeeds earlier in the film. And yet he also redeems himself by avenging the deaths of his grandfather and his nephew, as Thorin never actually learns that Kili had also been killed. Meanwhile, Bilbo wakes up and watches Thorin walk to the cliff. I would have preferred, however, that he crawled to the edge of the cliff, struggling to pull himself across the ice whilst bleeding heavily, thus making it very clear that Thorin is going to die. Despite my thoughts on Thorin's ability to stand up, I very much like that the first thing he does upon defeating Azog is check on the state of the battlefield. He wants to know that what he just went through was not for nothing, and given the timely arrival of the eagles, it appears that the orcs have been driven back into the tunnels and are in full retreat. Thorin then collapses, his task complete, knowing that they have been victorious. Bilbo approaches Thorin and attempts to stem the bleeding.
Don't move. Don't move. Lie still. Oh.
I wish to part from you in friendship.
No.
I will take back my word and my deed to the gate. Forgive me. I am so sorry that I have led you into such peril. Farewell, Master Burglar. Go back to your books. And your own chair. If more people valued home above gold, this world would be a merry place.
No, 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 Thorin.
And Thorin then passes. This scene is far and away the best scene in the Battle of the Five Armies. In the first film, we had Bilbo riddling with Gollum, in the second film, we had Bilbo talking with Smaug, and in the third film, we have Bilbo reconciling with Thorin. That this scene is at all emotionally effective is a testament to the acting of both Martin Freeman and Richard Armitage. In a better movie, this scene could have been phenomenal. Unfortunately, this scene requires 2 hours and 15 minutes of bullshit for it to exist. Even if you were to ruthlessly cut this trilogy down and remove as much of the insane nonsense as possible from this movie in particular, the emotional impact of this scene is entirely contingent upon Thorin reconciling with Bilbo, which is only necessary because of the crazy gold subplot, which may just be the most fundamentally broken part of this trilogy. Had the crazy gold subplot made a lick of sense, and had Thorin's succumbing to the sickness been at all coherent and believable, then this scene would have tied it all together masterfully. What we actually got, however, was a nonsensical setup with a fantastic resolution. I vastly prefer this to the inverse, where the resolution wastes the potential of the setup, so I will commend the filmmakers and the actors once again for getting this moment essentially pitch perfect. Okay, Azog is overconfident. And Thorin is a smart fighter, will die to ensure Azog is defeated, cares about his people, and is remorseful. We then cut away from the character death that I actually care about and the reaction of another character that I actually care about to Ladylas, who is mourning the death of her weapon of ass destruction. Meanwhile, Thranduil searches for Legolas, indicating that he did in fact decide to head to Ravenhill, albeit after the fighting had concluded. Given that he is not accompanied by any army, my presumption here was that he wanted to make sure his son had not fallen, although that Legolas's insistence on helping the dwarves did not prompt the same response is interesting. We simply have to assume that Thranduil was so shocked by the large number of elven casualties that he prioritized pulling his forces out over helping his son. Legolas tells his father that he cannot go back, and Thranduil asks where he will go. There are a couple of reasons why Legolas may not want to go back to his home, and I think the intention here fundamentally is that his experience in the last 2 films has changed him. He has learned to respect dwarves to some degree, Thorin in particular. He has also potentially grown out of his horny adolescent phase, and he has also severely damaged his relationship with his father. Probably most importantly, however, he has experienced combat on a massive scale. He is now well aware of what the enemy is capable of, and so he is no longer content with chilling in Mirkwood. This actually fits rather well with his portrayal in the Fellowship of the Ring, as he is not initially hostile towards Gimli, rather it is Gimli who initiates their feud.
Have you heard nothing Lord Elrond has said? The ring must be destroyed.
And I suppose you think you're the one to do it. I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf.
So, Thranduil tells his son,
Find the Dunedain. There's a young ranger amongst them. You should meet him. His father, Arathon, was a good man. His son might grow to be a great one.
What is his name?
He is known in the wild as Strider. His true name, you must discover for yourself.
Do you think the scene should have been cut?
Going purely from the source material, Aragorn would have been around 10 years old at this point in time. However, the films follow a slightly different timeline. In the books, there is a 17-year gap from when Frodo acquires the ring to when he first meets Aragorn. As this is obviously not the case in the films, this would mean Aragorn is approximately 27 years old at the time at which this scene is taking place. Given this information, could Thranduil feasibly have heard about this incredible 27-year-old's accomplishments? Yes, this is plausible. Does that alone justify this scene's inclusion?
Absolutely fucking not.
Thranduil tells his son to randomly go out and find one particular 27-year-old dude for seemingly no reason whatsoever. This is fan service at its most blatant and intrusive. There is no in-universe reason for them to be having this discussion. Thranduil may as well be saying, I hear there are 2 young hobbits in the Shire who you should meet. They make excellent sausages, tomatoes, and nice crispy bacon. There is no reason at all why Thranduil would want Legolas to go and see Aragorn, and the only reason this line is here is to prompt the drooling masses to garble incoherently at each other.
I just came.
Anyway, as Legolas leaves, Thranduil tells him that his mother loved him more than life itself. They then gesture at each other respectfully, and he takes his leave. We then see that Thranduil is teary-eyed at his son's departure, possibly acknowledging that his own behavior contributed to this decision. He then approaches Ladylas and her deceased Flugenheimer.
If this is love, I do not want it.
Bitch, you are 1,000 years old. Am I really supposed to believe you have never had your cheeks clapped before?
Why does it hurt so much?
Well, he ain't getting any deader.
This is actively hysterical. Ladylas is behaving as if she is 10 years old and her boo has stopped texting her back. Thranduil's response is that the reason it hurts so much is because it was real. He has seemingly accepted that she was truly in love with Kili, and this is perhaps informed by his rather brittle emotional state following his conversation with Legolas. This, plus the fact that Ladylas did demonstrate to him in no uncertain terms that she was willing to die for her love, is enough to convince him that he was wrong.
What you feel for that dwarf is not real.
Why does it hurt so much?
Because it was real.
Thranduil's reaction to Ladylas's grief, I like. The fact that the film treats this as some massive realization for Ladylas, however, is absurd. What I also find interesting is that she is so focused on how sad she is that she does not make any mention of the fact that Thranduil could easily have prevented Kili's death. Thranduil is also not given the chance to grapple with this idea, possibly because he doesn't particularly care about one dead dwarf. As this is the final scene we get for these 2 characters, I think it is worth mentioning that we get absolutely no closure with regard to Thranduil. Everything he has done in this trilogy has been with the goal of obtaining white gems of pure starlight from Erebor. He was willing to go to war in pursuit of this. As Thorin has now died, and as we are about to see Dane be crowned king under the mountain, it is highly unlikely that Thranduil will ever achieve this goal. Dane has even less of a reason to give Thranduil anything than Thorin did. And because the film does not address this, we can only assume that after this scene, Thranduil simply abandoned his centuries-long quest to acquire gems from Erebor. In the grand scheme of things, this is a very minor plot thread, so I can absolutely see why this was not included as the trilogy wraps up, but this just highlights how wafer-thin Thranduil's motivations were. The gems were mentioned once or twice, their existence facilitated his presence within this film, and then they were promptly forgotten about. Thranduil loves his son, conceals his emotions well, and acknowledges when he is wrong. And Ladylas is entirely unfamiliar with the concept of love. Cut to Bilbo, who is approached by Gandalf in the aftermath of the battle. As he cleans his pipe, neither one seems to know what to say. It is pretty clear. Bilbo has changed, just as Gandalf predicted.
Can you promise that I will come back?
No. And if you do, you will not be the same.
They then watch the dwarves as they mourn the loss of their king. The Lake Townians also then pay their respects to Thorin. Again, the question as to whether or not Dane will pay what Thorin had promised them is left unanswered. We then see that Thorin is to be buried alongside his nephews, with the Arkenstone, the king's jewel, in hand. The dwarves then welcome their new king, Thorin's cousin, Dane. So although I like this scene, and I honestly have absolutely no idea why it was not in the theatrical cut, I do have a rather important question. Is the idea here, now that the Arkenstone has been buried with Thorin, that the whole crazy gold thing is just not a factor anymore? Because if that's what is intended, then that's absolutely not how this has been seen to work. More than likely, Dane will also succumb to the exact same sickness as Thorin, possibly even more severely, as Gandalf told us previously.
I've always found Thorin the more reasonable of the two.
This isn't particularly relevant to this movie, but it definitely means that this is far more of a bittersweet ending than what is initially implied. And it suggests that the reason Dane and his army did not help whatsoever during The Lord of the Rings is because Dane had been afflicted with being fucking bonkers. Additionally, if the Arkenstone is now buried, then this would imply that Dane cannot rule over the 7 dwarven kingdoms, as he does not bear the king's jewel. Yes, the other dwarves could just kind of accept him as their king, but to that idea I say nay, as the entire plot of these films is contingent upon that very thing being outside of the realms of possibility. That said, this scene closes the book on the dwarves of Erebor. They have completed their quest, they have reclaimed their home, and have instilled a new king. Without this scene's inclusion, there is no closure for the dwarves, so I am very happy to see it included in the extended cut. Anyway, at the entrance to Erebor, a teary-eyed Balin tells Bilbo of the great feast they will have to honor Thorin. I will play you parts of this scene now because I do quite like it, and I think describing it won't do it justice.
Songs will be sung, tales will be told. Thorin Oakenshield will pass into legend.
I know that's how you must honor him, but to me he was never that. To me, he was... Well, I think I'll slip quietly away. Will you tell the others I said goodbye?
You can tell them yourself.
This is an excellent send-off for Bilbo, and it clearly shows that all of the surviving dwarves truly consider him to be one of their own. One issue here is that this development happened entirely within the first film, which is something I will go into in the final autopsy video. Bilbo extends to them an open invitation to visit him in the Shire, and he departs. This scene is very selective with its dialogue, and Bilbo occasionally finds himself unable to speak because he is understandably overwhelmed. This is a rare moment in these films where the emotion and the acting is front and center. We then see Bilbo and Gandalf's journey home. Gandalf accompanies Bilbo as far as the borders of the Shire, and he then says,
You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by luck, 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 luck?
I know there is a follow-up that contextualizes this line, but in isolation, I find it extremely funny that this line is in this film, given everything that has happened.
Magic rings should not be used lightly, Bilbo.
So here it is revealed that Gandalf knew about the ring from the moment Bilbo appeared to them outside of the Goblin tunnels. This is something that, on first viewing, I considered to be absolutely catastrophic. But now I am less sure. Gandalf knows that Bilbo has a magical ring, and this is evidently nothing particularly abnormal for Middle-Earth. Gandalf himself, of course, also has a magical ring. Given Gandalf's seeming indifference to Bilbo having a magic ring, I think it is probably also safe to assume that there are lesser magical rings within Middle-Earth that are not the One Ring. As Gandalf seems to believe that the One Ring was swept out to sea by the Anduin, there is no immediate reason why he should suspect that Bilbo's ring is the One Ring. That is what I have in defense of Gandalf's lack of concern. Unfortunately, there is a flip side to that ring. In Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf begins to suspect that Bilbo's ring is the One Ring after he attempts to touch it. It is unclear exactly what happens here, as the flash of the Eye of Sauron is only there for the benefit of the audience, so my interpretation is that Gandalf is able to sense some kind of dark magic when he touches the ring. He then travels to Minas Tirith and confirms that it is indeed the One Ring. The suggestion, then, is that had Gandalf merely touched the ring in this scene, he would have then known 60 years early that it is the One Ring. The question as to how reasonable it is to expect Gandalf to not only allow Bilbo to keep the ring, but also to not even ask to inspect it, is an open question. As Bilbo goes on to lie to Gandalf and claim that he lost the ring during the battle, the writers could very easily have had Gandalf ask to see the ring, only for Bilbo to then claim it to be lost, which would have gone some way towards plugging this hole, and would have made Gandalf's reaction to Bilbo's disappearance in the Fellowship of the Ring more explicable. I don't really have a strong opinion either way. My preference, however, would have been that they remove this dialogue exchange entirely, as then the question is never asked. This would then also mean that Gandalf's first knowledge of Bilbo's magic ring would have been when he went invisible at the beginning of Fellowship, as was heavily implied by that movie.
I suppose you think that was terribly clever. There are many magic rings in this world, Bilbo Baggins, and none of them should be used lightly.
Gandalf's reaction here certainly makes a lot less sense if he already knew that Bilbo had a magical ring that can turn him invisible, and my presumption is that the reason this scene exists in the Battle of the Five Armies is so as to tie it in neatly with the Lord of the Rings by having Bilbo and Gandalf unknowingly discuss the central MacGuffin of that trilogy. Anyway, Bilbo bids Gandalf farewell and he returns home. He then finds that his belongings are in the process of being auctioned off, as the other residents of the Shire had presumed Bilbo to be dead. Meaning that Bilbo has returned home after over a year, and coincidentally he arrived back on the exact day that his belongings were being sold.
Stop! Stop!
Who are you?
You know perfectly well who I am, Lobelia Sackville Baggins.
Sure, why not end the film on a needless convenience and more fan service? We certainly haven't had our fill of that. For some strange reason, Bilbo is then asked to prove that he is in fact Bilbo Baggins, as seemingly the entire town has forgotten what he looked like. And so he presents the contract that he signed in the first film.
A contract of employment. There, my signature.
Oh, it certainly seems to be in order. Who is this person you pledged your service to? Thorin Oakenshield.
He was my friend.
I fucking love this. And I fucking hate that they couldn't think of a better way to include it than to have the entirety of the Shire forget who Bilbo is. Bilbo here is able to finish verbalizing the thought that he had at Erebor.
And to me, he was... He was my friend.
Enough time has passed for him to come to terms with Thorin's death, and he is finally able to speak those words, which end up being the final words of the film, concluding this trilogy with Bilbo reminiscing about his friend Thorin. Ha! If only. Bilbo then feels drawn to the ring and decides to take it out of his pocket for another look, revealing that he did not lose it as he had told Gandalf earlier, which of course we as the audience already knew. We then cut forwards to Gandalf's arrival at Bag End in Fellowship of the Ring.
We don't want any more visitors, well-wishers, or distant relations.
And what about very old friends?
Meaning that the movie has thrown away its potential for an ending centered around Bilbo and Thorin's friendship and has instead opted for characters being idiots, contrivances, and nostalgia baiting. I actually can't think of a more fitting end for this trilogy. The films seem to think they are about Bilbo and Thorin, and whilst this is true to some degree, it is utterly overshadowed by an endless stream of idiotic characters, insane contrivances, and wasted time injecting nostalgia for the sake of nostalgia. And with that, dear viewer, we cut to the credits. So, that concludes my thoughts on the Battle of the Five Armies. The length of this script has exceeded even my expectations, and so that is the reason why this one took a little longer to release than I had intended. But we are not done yet. Regulars on the channel may be aware that when I covered Rings of Power, I concluded the series with a final autopsy video, where I collected all of my thoughts on the series as a whole and gave definitive conclusions. I have decided that I will do a similar video to round out the Hobbit is Not Very Good series. That said, I am still working out exactly how I'm going to structure that video, as the reasons why Rings of Power is not very good are generally not the reasons why The Hobbit is not very good. I have no idea how long that video will be, or how long it will take me to make it, but stay tuned because that video is coming next. I will save most of my final thoughts on the trilogy for that video, but for now I will offer as much of a conclusion as I can with regard to the Battle of the Five Armies. This film is absolutely the worst of the three. The disparity in quality between this and Fellowship of the Ring is not dissimilar to the disparity between The Empire Strikes Back and The Phantom Menace. There were not 5 armies in combat at any point in time. The elves retreated before Gundabad arrived, and as I already mentioned, Gundabad did not appear to make it to the battle before being defeated by the Eagles. There are multiple massive action set pieces, and not one of them feels grounded in any way whatsoever. A huge amount of the narrative is reliant on one character being crazy in a very specific way. There is an overabundance of reliance on visual effects for the various armies, meaning that it is incredibly difficult to take any of this seriously. Virtually all of the fighting became numbing because I cared about very few of the characters, and those I did care about were seemingly invincible until they weren't. The insane physics and slapstick comedy have been dialed up to 11. The film spends an unfathomable amount of time on Greasebag, which is criminal for reasons I already went into. The sheer amount of bloat in this film is unlike any other. Now, for the bits I liked. Thorin's climactic battle with Azog and his reconciliation with Bilbo was mostly excellent. This film contains the most emotionally effective scenes in the trilogy, although this is largely as a result of the narrative payoffs being contained within this film. The acting is generally excellent, with 1 or 2 exceptions. Lee Pace as Thranduil is the highlight of the film for me, both as a performance and as a character, with Dane as a close second. So, with that, dear viewer, it is time for me to depart. I want to give a massive thank you to each and every one of you who has been watching my videos. Somehow, enough people are enjoying my content for me to essentially be doing this full time. I am immensely grateful for all of the support from you guys. It honestly means the world to me. I also want to give a special thank you to Happy Nihilist, Gagalum the Mad Goose Wizard, Gurney, Spunkifier, Chewy, Trufflepup, Vanessa Reader, Evie, Skyflopper, Ryan, Cry, Pixel Pit, Poison Sumac, Nezul, Tank, and Ozzy for providing the rather excellent drawings as seen earlier in the video. So, if you have made it this far, please do consider liking, sharing, or subscribing, as it will help me make more videos like this in future. If you have not already, check out our community Discord server, link in the description, where you will also find a link to my Patreon if you want to support me directly. Thank you so much for watching this stupidly long video, and I will see you in the next one.